Hello story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. The story begins on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air is cool enough to bite at your nose, but not so cold that you can't enjoy the outdoors. I remember this day vividly because it was supposed to be a simple, peaceful escape from the routine, a chance to reconnect with nature and clear my mind. It was early October, and the woods near my small town had transformed into a kaleidoscope of gold, amber, and fiery red. The forest was a place I had visited countless times as a kid. Back then, it felt like an endless world of wonder, a playground of towering trees and winding trails. But this time, I wasn't just wandering for fun. My friend Nathan and I had decided to take on one of the longer trails we'd often talked about, but never had the time to tackle. It wasn't particularly challenging, but it stretched deep into a less traveled part of the forest. The plan was straightforward: hike for a few hours, stop at a clearing we knew had a great view of the valley, and return well before sunset. Nathan was the kind of guy you'd call reliable. He wasn't the adventurous type who'd drag you into risky situations, but he was always up for something out of the ordinary. I trusted him to keep things on track, and honestly, that's probably why I didn't think twice about agreeing to this hike. We packed light water bottles, some trail mix, a flashlight, and a map of the area. Phones were fully charged, though reception out there was notoriously spotty. I remember Nathan laughing as he shoved his phone into his bag, saying, "Not like we're gonna need this anyway. We know this place like the back of our hands." Famous last words. The trailhead wasn't far from the parking lot, a short gravel path leading into the dense forest. I can still hear the crunch of my boots against the gravel, the sound gradually softening as we stepped onto the dirt trail. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows that danced with the breeze. We started with lighthearted conversation, catching up on life and joking about how out of shape we were. The trail was easy to follow, marked by the occasional wooden sign and the distinct trampled path of years of hikers before us. About an hour in, we passed an old wooden bridge that stretched over a shallow creek. It had been there for decades, its planks worn smooth by time. This spot always felt like a checkpoint of sorts, a gateway to the deeper parts of the forest. Once you crossed it, the world seemed quieter, more detached from the bustle of life outside. We stopped briefly to take in the scenery. The creek below was clear, the water reflecting the sunlight like shattered glass. It was the kind of sight that made you feel small, reminded you of how vast and ancient the world really is. Nathan snapped a photo on his phone, shaking his head as he said, "Too bad nobody's gonna see this. No signal out here." As we pressed on, the trail began to narrow, the trees closing in around us. The air felt heavier, filled with the earthy scent of damp leaves and moss. We passed a few fallen logs, their surfaces blanketed in patches of bright green lichen. "Hey, remember when we used to climb stuff like that?" Nathan said, pointing at a particularly massive tree trunk lying on its side. "I swear we thought we were invincible back then." I laughed, shaking my head. "Yeah, and one of us usually ended up with a sprained ankle or a ripped shirt." It was a comfortable kind of nostalgia, the kind that made you feel like you'd stepped back in time. By mid-morning, we reached the clearing. It was just as I remembered, a wide open space where the trees gave way to a sweeping view of the valley below. The horizon stretched endlessly, dotted with clusters of trees and the faint outline of distant hills. We sat on a flat rock near the edge, pulling out our snacks and water. After resting for about half an hour, we decided it was time to head back. The sun was still high, but we didn't want to push our luck. The forest wasn't the kind of place you wanted to be after dark, not because of any supernatural fears, but simply because it was easy to lose your way. We retraced our steps, talking less now, the peaceful silence of the woods wrapping around us like a warm blanket. The creek, The bridge, the familiar bends in the trail, all of it passed in a blur of quiet footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It wasn't until we were about 15 minutes from the trailhead that I noticed something odd. The first sign of trouble was so subtle I almost didn't notice it. The forest had grown quieter as we hiked back toward the trailhead, but I chalked it up to the time of day. Birds quiet down as the afternoon wanes, right? At least, that's what I told myself. Nathan was walking a few steps ahead, his boots crunching the dried leaves underfoot. We weren't talking much anymore, just enjoying the serenity of the woods. But as we rounded a bend in the trail, something made me stop. It wasn't a sound exactly, it was the absence of sound. The forest, which had been alive with the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of squirrels, was suddenly still. No wind in the trees, no distant hum of insects, nothing. It was as if someone had pressed a mute button on nature itself. I paused, looking around. "Hey, do you hear that?" I asked, my voice sounding louder than I'd intended in the oppressive silence. Nathan stopped and turned, a puzzled look on his face. "Hear what?" "That's just it. There's nothing. It's too quiet." He shrugged. "Maybe we scared something off. You're overthinking it, man. Come on, we're almost back." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. Nathan was probably right. Forests have their own rhythms, their own quirks. But as we kept walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until a few minutes later that the next oddity presented itself. We were approaching the wooden bridge, the familiar landmark that marked the home stretch of our hike. But as we got closer, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The bridge was different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The structure itself looked the same weathered planks, the same moss creeping up the sides. But the air around it felt different, heavier somehow. And then it hit me. The creek below, which had been clear and babbling earlier, was now completely still. "Nathan," I said, pointing toward the bridge. "Do you remember the water being like that?" He squinted, then frowned. "No, it was moving earlier. Fast too." We walked closer, peering over the side of the bridge. The water, which had been shimmering and alive just a few hours ago, now looked like a sheet of glass. It reflected the canopy above with an almost unnatural clarity, as if it weren't water at all, but a mirror. "That's weird," Nathan muttered, his voice tinged with unease for the first time. "Yeah, really weird." I leaned over the edge, trying to see if there was some kind of blockage downstream, something that might explain the sudden stillness. But the creek stretched on, undisturbed. Nathan's voice broke the silence. "Let's just keep moving. We're overthinking it." We crossed the bridge, but the sense of unease lingered. I couldn't help but glance back, half expecting to see something or someone standing there. But the trail behind us was empty, the bridge as still and silent as the creek below. As we continued, I noticed something else. The forest didn't just feel quieter, it felt darker. The dappled sunlight that had guided us earlier was fading faster than it should have been. The shadows seemed longer, deeper, as if the trees were closing in around us. Nathan must have noticed it too, because he stopped and pulled out his flashlight. "It's not even that late," he said, clicking it on. "Why does it feel like the sun's already setting?" I didn't have an answer. The next incident was harder to ignore. We were about 10 minutes from the parking lot when we came across something in the middle of the trail. At first, I thought it was a fallen branch, but as we got closer, I realized it wasn't a branch at all. It was a pile of rocks. Not just random stones scattered across the trail, but a deliberate stack of 5 smooth stones, balanced precariously on top of each other. Nathan stared at it, his face unreadable. "That wasn't here earlier, was it?" I shook my head. "No, we'd have noticed." He crouched down, studying the stack. "It's probably just someone messing around. You know, hikers leaving their little whatever this is." "Yeah, maybe." But my voice didn't sound convincing, even to me. Nathan nudged the stack with his boot, knocking it over. The stones tumbled to the ground with a dull clatter. "Let's go," he said, his tone more curt than usual. We picked up the pace after that, neither of us saying much. The silence between us wasn't the comfortable kind anymore. It was heavy, like we were both trying not to voice the thoughts gnawing at the edges of our minds. It wasn't long before we saw another stack. This one was off the trail, perched on a fallen log. It was smaller, only 3 stones, but just as deliberate. Nathan didn't stop this time. He muttered something under his breath and kept walking, his flashlight beam cutting through the growing dimness. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see movement in the trees. But the forest was still, as if holding its breath. The final straw came just as the parking lot was supposed to come into view. We'd been walking faster, almost jogging, eager to put the unsettling trail behind us. The stacks of stones had appeared a few more times, always just off the path, as if someone or something was leaving them for us to find. Nathan was the first to stop. He held up his hand, signaling me to do the same. "What?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Do you hear that?" I strained my ears, my heart thudding in my chest. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the winds. But then I heard it, a faint rustling, coming from somewhere off the trail. It wasn't the kind of rustling you'd expect from an animal. It was slower, more deliberate, like someone moving through the underbrush, trying not to be seen. Nathan's flashlight swept over the trees, the beam darting back and forth. But there was nothing. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight. We practically ran the rest of the way, the parking lot coming into view like a beacon of safety. But as we reached the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Nathan unlocked the doors, and we climbed in, slamming them shut. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the silence inside the car almost as heavy as the silence in the woods. Finally, Nathan broke it. "That was weird, right?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We thought the worst was behind us. After we left the woods, I didn't think much more about what had happened, at least not consciously. The quiet creek, the strange stone stacks, and that feeling of being watched, they all seemed like fleeting, unnerving moments that we could brush off. But the next few days proved me wrong. The first strange event happened just after Nathan and I got back to our apartments. I had barely settled into my usual routine when my phone buzzed. It was Nathan. "Hey man, I've been thinking about the trail," he said, his voice tight. "And, I don't know, it's been bugging me. The thing with the stones." That wasn't normal. I had to agree, but I didn't want to dwell on it. Maybe it was some weird hikers, man. People do odd things out there. "Yeah," he replied, but there was something in his voice I couldn't ignore. But I don't know. It felt intentional. I hung up the phone, trying to push it out of my mind. I was working late that night, so I figured the distraction would do me some good. The next day, things got even stranger. I had planned to go out for a run early in the morning, as I usually did, but I didn't make it far before something stopped me in my tracks. There, at the edge of the trail in the small park near my apartment, was a stack of stones. 3 stones. Just like the ones we'd seen on the trail. It made no sense. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone nearby, maybe another hiker or jogger who thought it would be funny. But the park was empty, as it always was at that hour. No one in sight. My heart rate quickened. I didn't know why, but the sight of the stack sent a chill through me. I took a step closer, eyeing the stones, their smooth surfaces catching the early morning light. Someone had placed them here. I was certain of it. I reached down, brushing the stones with my fingers. It felt like I was being watched again, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. Just then, my phone buzzed. "Nathan." I picked it up without thinking. "Dude, I just saw another stack." His voice was barely a whisper, like he didn't want to say it out loud. I swallowed hard. "Where?" "At the old bench by the lake. I was walking my dog, and there it was 3 stones. Same as the ones we saw on the trail." I didn't say anything for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Are we being followed?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Nathan's response was quick, but shaky. I don't know, man, but this feels wrong. The next few days felt like an endless cycle of strange occurrences. Each time I tried to shake off the feeling, something else would happen to pull me back in. I started noticing the stacks more and more. Sometimes they were on sidewalks, sometimes they were in the middle of empty streets. It was as if someone or something was deliberately placing them in my path, pushing me to notice. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence. After all, people do strange things. But after the fourth or fifth stack, I couldn't deny that something was off. Nathan and I talked about it again, this time in person. We met up at a coffee shop near his place, both of us looking over our shoulders like we were being watched. "This is too much," Nathan said, his hands trembling around his cup. "I feel like something is trying to tell us something, or maybe it's warning us." I looked at him, my gut twisting. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You saw what happened on the trail, right? The water, it was wrong. And those stacks, they keep showing up. It's like someone wants us to know something, but it's like they're playing a game with us. I don't know how else to explain it." I thought about it for a moment, weighing his words. "What do you think we should do?" "I don't know," Nathan muttered, "but I feel like we need to go back. To the trail, to the bridge. Something's not right." I felt my stomach tighten at the thought. "I don't know, man. It's getting weird." But Nathan's face was set, and I knew he wasn't going to drop it. 2 days later, we were back on the trail. It wasn't easy, but we both knew we had to face whatever was happening. Nathan insisted on bringing his flashlight, and I couldn't exactly argue with that. The forest seemed darker this time, even though the sun was still high in the sky. As we approached the bridge again, I noticed the stillness first. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on us from all sides. And of course, there was the creek. It was still, completely still. I walked over to the edge, trying not to let my fear show. The water looked like a mirror again. It didn't make sense. Nathan was already inspecting the stone stacks that had appeared near the bridge. But this time, they were different. They weren't stacked haphazardly. They were arranged in a pattern, almost like a symbol. "What the hell is this?" Nathan muttered, kneeling down to get a better look. I didn't know what to say. The stones had been placed with too much care, too much intent. It was as if someone had designed the arrangement specifically for us to see. And that's when I heard it. A rustling in the trees, much too close. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. But there was no one there. No sign of movement, nothing. But I could feel it, that unmistakable presence. Nathan stood up, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I replied, my voice shaking. "We're not alone." We spent the next hour walking deeper into the forest, our eyes darting around, half expecting something or someone to appear. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. We didn't talk much, both of us too focused on the feeling of being watched. And then we saw it. Another stack. But this one was different. It was larger, taller, with stones that didn't look like they belonged in the forest. They were smooth, black, and unnaturally polished. They didn't match the rocks we'd seen before. These looked like they had been carefully crafted. "Where did these come from?" Nathan asked, his voice low and fearful. I didn't have an answer. The forest had swallowed us whole. The once familiar trail now felt like an entirely different world, a place where reality warped and shifted. We had been walking for what seemed like hours, but the sun never moved. It hung, suspended in the sky, casting an eerie light over the trees. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, creeping between the trunks in ways that defied logic. We were far from the trailhead now, lost in the labyrinth of trees and underbrush, following an invisible pull deeper into the wilderness. Nathan was ahead of me, moving quickly, as if he too could feel the tightening of the air around us. His flashlight flickered with every step, casting brief moments of illumination before plunging us into darkness again. We hadn't spoken in a while, but we didn't need to. Our footsteps echoed in the stillness, too loud, too urgent, as if the woods themselves were closing in. The feeling that something was watching us, something older and far more powerful than anything we could understand, had only grown stronger. We'd been through this forest countless times before, no, not like this. The way the trees seemed to bend toward us, their gnarled limbs reaching, twisting in unnatural angles, it was all wrong. And the stacks of stones, the way they kept appearing, the way they seemed to guide us. I couldn't stop my eyes from darting back to the stones. I couldn't help it. It was like they were a trail, leading us further and further into the heart of the woods. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I wanted to admit. "This isn't right. This isn't the trail anymore." Nathan didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear me. His face was pale, his eyes fixed ahead, staring at something I couldn't see. He was moving faster now, his pace quickening, his breath ragged. "Nathan!" I shouted, but my voice felt swallowed by the forest, lost in the thick air. He didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. It was like he was under a spell, something pulling him forward, and I could feel the same force tugging at me, urging me to follow. But I hesitated. There was something in the air, something wrong that made my stomach churn. I was about to call out again when I heard it, a sound, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. The sound of something moving through the trees. It wasn't the rustling of animals or the wind pushing through the leaves. No, this was deliberate, methodical. Someone was moving toward us. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. My eyes darted around, searching the shadows between the trees. Nathan turned then, his face pale as a ghost. He was staring at something in the distance, something that was far too far away, yet felt unnervingly close. "Nathan," I whispered, but he didn't answer. His mouth was moving, but no words came out. He seemed to be mumbling something under his breath. His eyes were wide, staring at the trees as if they held something just beyond the veil of reality. I followed his gaze. There, in the distance, standing just at the edge of the trees, was something or someone shrouded in darkness. It was impossible to make out details. The figure was tall, far taller than any human, and it seemed to be cloaked in the forest itself. It blended in with the trees, almost as if it was made of the shadows that clung to the trunks. But there was something distinct about it, something unmistakable. The figure moved, slowly, deliberately. It took a step toward us, its form bending unnaturally, like the branches of the trees themselves were twisting toward it. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My body felt like stone, rooted to the ground. My eyes were locked on the figure, and I couldn't look away, couldn't tear myself from the horrible sight. Nathan finally spoke, but his voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "We shouldn't be here. We need to leave. Now." It was too late. The figure took another step, and the ground beneath our feet seemed to tremble, just slightly, as if the earth itself was responding to his presence. The air thickened, pressing in on me, making it hard to breathe. I could feel the weight of something ancient and powerful closing in around us, suffocating, pulling us deeper into its grip. And then I saw it, something even more terrifying than the figure itself. On the ground, just in front of the creature, was a stone. A single stone, dark and smooth, its surface reflecting the dim light like a mirror. I remembered it. I recognized it. It was one of the stones from the stacks we had seen before. But this wasn't just any stone. It had a symbol carved into it, something jagged and twisted, like an ancient rune. It was the same symbol that had been carved into the stones at the bridge, at the lake, at every stack we had seen. "Stop." Nathan's voice broke through the fog of fear that had settled over me. He was trembling now, his hands shaking violently. "We have to go. Now." I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the ground, as if the very earth was holding me in place. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, from the stone. And then it spoke. Not in words, not in any language I could understand, but in a sound, a low hum that seemed to reverberate through the air itself. It was more of a feeling than a sound, a vibration that went deep into my bones, shaking something loose inside me. I could feel it in my chest, in my head, in the very marrow of my bones. It was as though it was speaking directly to me, to my soul, whispering something ancient and terrifying, something I couldn't comprehend, but felt in every fiber of my being. I turned to Nathan. He was on his knees now, his hands gripping his head, his face contorted in terror. "It's too late. We can't escape." His voice was barely audible, trembling with fear. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure was moving closer now, and the world around me seemed to dissolve, as though I was slipping out of reality itself. The trees, the forest, the ground, it all felt distant, unreal. There was only the figure and the stone, and the unshakable feeling that we had crossed some line we couldn't uncross. The figure reached out, its long, twisted limbs extending toward us. And then, in one fluid motion, it was upon us. I could feel its presence, cold, ancient, and infinite. I felt as if I were drowning in it, suffocating beneath its weight. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The world snapped back into focus, the air clearing, the trees standing tall once more. The hum in the air faded, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. But Nathan was gone. I looked around, desperate, my heart hammering in my chest. But Nathan was nowhere to be found. The forest was silent, too silent. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain. We had uncovered something that wasn't meant to be uncovered. I stood alone in the forest, surrounded by the oppressive silence. The air felt thick, pressing in on me like a physical weight. The trees, once familiar and comforting, now seemed like dark sentinels, watching, waiting. I turned in circles, searching, but Nathan was gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole, leaving no trace behind. No footprints, no sign of struggle, just the same, unbroken earth. The fear I felt before had morphed into something else, now something deeper. It wasn't just fear. It was a terrible knowing that I had crossed into a place that was no longer part of the world I knew. There were no more questions left to ask, no more things to be explained. Only a profound, hollow emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. I should have run. I should have turned and fled the moment I saw that thing, that figure cloaked in darkness. But I hadn't. I had stayed, driven by some desperate need to understand, to make sense of the impossible. And now, I was here alone, left to live with whatever consequences that choice had brought. I looked at the stone again, still lying on the ground in front of me, its symbol etched deeply into its surface. The hum that had vibrated through the air was gone, but I could still feel its echo deep in my chest. It felt like the stone was calling to me, urging me to do something, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. My body was frozen, locked in place by the weight of what had happened. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. There was no way I could stay here. I didn't know if Nathan was alive or gone, but I knew I couldn't afford to waste any more time. If I was to survive, I had to get out of this forest. I had to leave before whatever that thing was came back for me, too. I turned my back on the stone and began walking. The path I had once known so well was now a twisted maze, a series of indistinct trails leading nowhere. Every direction felt wrong. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches creaking in the breeze as though they were alive, watching, waiting. The sound of my footsteps, once comforting and steady, now seemed far too loud, like they were echoing off the very air, drawing attention to my every move. The panic began to set in again, creeping up my spine, tightening my chest. Was I even heading in the right direction? Was there a right direction? Or was I just going deeper into this nightmare, becoming part of it, a prisoner of the woods? I pushed on, ignoring the growing sense of dread that tugged at my mind. I had to make it out. I had to find my way back. I couldn't stay here, couldn't let whatever this was consume me as it had Nathan. I couldn't even think about that right now. I had to focus. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their twisted forms growing more and more grotesque with every passing minute. The shadows seemed deeper here, as if the light itself was reluctant to enter this part of the forest. My flashlight flickered again, casting brief flashes of illumination before plunging me back into darkness. I walked faster. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up, but I couldn't stop now. Every rustle in the underbrush, every creak of a branch above me, made my heart race. The forest felt alive with something ancient and powerful, something that I wasn't sure I could outrun. Suddenly, there was a sound behind me, a twig snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I whirled around, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Nothing. Just the trees. Just the darkness. I was losing it. I was hearing things now. It was just the forest playing tricks on me, my mind unspooling in the terror of the moment. I had to keep moving. I had to escape. I forced myself to continue forward, pushing through the thick underbrush, my limbs growing heavier with each step. It felt like the forest was pushing back against me, its branches reaching out to grab hold of me, to pull me into its depths. And then I saw it. The edge of the forest. I had reached it finally. The trees began to thin out, the dense canopy above giving way to open sky. The relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, my heart still racing, but I could see the distant outline of the town through the trees. It wasn't much farther now. I could make it. I could. A cold hand gripped my shoulder, spinning me around with terrifying force. I gasped, stumbling backward, heart leaping into my throat. I knew what was standing there before I even looked. The figure, the one I had seen earlier, the one that had come for Nathan, it was here. I couldn't scream. My throat was dry, my body trembling. The creature was taller than I had ever imagined, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, like they were made of the forest itself, twisted and wrong. Its face was still a blur, a shadow wrapped in shadow, but I could feel its presence, feel its eyes on me. They weren't eyes in the human sense. They were something else, something that could see far beyond the flesh, beyond the boundaries of the world I knew. I stumbled backward, trying to get away, but the creature was too close. It reached out with one long arm, and I could feel its cold breath against my face. For a moment, everything stood still. The world seemed to stop. The forest, the air, the weight of the moment. I stood there, paralyzed by the fear of what I was facing. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. I blinked, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The figure, the creature, had it been real? Had I imagined it? But there was no time to think about that now. I couldn't afford to question reality anymore. I had to get out. I ran. I didn't care what was chasing me anymore. I didn't care if it was real or not. I just needed to escape. The edge of the forest was now in front of me. A few more steps, and I would be free. I could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, the sound of civilization. With every ounce of energy I had left, I pushed forward, my legs burning, my lungs aching. I stumbled out of the woods, the trees parting in front of me like the gates to some other world. And just like that, I was out. I collapsed to the ground, my heart still pounding in my chest. The town was just a short distance away, and the sounds of life cars, people, the normal hum of everyday existence washed over me like a soothing balm. But something was missing. Nathan was gone. And as I sat there, gasping for breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had claimed him. That no matter how far I ran, I would never truly escape it. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized I was right. It was far from over. I left the woods behind me, but I couldn't escape the feeling that it hadn't truly let me go. The town, with its bright lights and bustling streets, felt distant, almost foreign to me now. It was as if I had crossed a threshold into a different reality, one where the rules I once knew no longer applied. The encounter, the forest, Nathan, it all stayed with me, like a shadow that never left. I thought about him constantly, wondering if he was out there somewhere, lost in the woods like I almost was. Or worse, whether he had become part of whatever it was that had been hunting us. The days that followed blurred into one another. I tried to return to normal life, tried to erase the terror that had taken root in me, but it was impossible. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, even in the safety of the town, waiting for something to creep out of the corners of my vision. My sleep became fractured, interrupted by dreams of the forest's twisted trees, cold shadows, the figure that had haunted us both. It wasn't just the fear that lingered, though. It was the unanswered questions. I could feel them gnawing at me, deep inside. I wanted to know what had happened to Nathan, but I was too afraid to go back and look. What if the forest still held him? What if there was no way out? There were no answers, just an endless loop of uncertainty. And then there was the creature. The thing that had come for me, that had stood before me like some kind of twisted nightmare. What was it? Why had it chosen us? Was Nathan's disappearance part of something larger? Or had we simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been warned. The creature, the strange vibrations in the air, the sense that the forest was alive, it all seemed like a message. But who was it for? Was it me? Or was it for anyone who dared to enter that place? I tried to push it all out of my mind, tried to live my life again, but it was like trying to erase a scar that ran too deep. No matter how much I wanted to forget, it clung to me. It was there when I went to bed, when I tried to relax with friends, when I walked the streets of the town. The fear was always there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to surface. Months passed, and though the days grew longer, the nights colder, I couldn't shake the sense of unfinished business. The woods had taken something from me, not just Nathan, but part of myself. And I knew, deep down, that I would never be truly free until I confronted whatever had happened there. The forest called to me, even from afar. It wasn't the same call as before, it wasn't desperate or terrifying, but it was there, pulling me back. It wasn't just the need to understand what had happened, though. It was more than that. The forest had changed me, marked me in ways I couldn't explain. It was only a matter of time before I went back. But when that day came, I didn't go alone. I couldn't be sure why I asked her, why I invited her to come with me. Maybe I needed someone else there, someone who could see what I had seen. Or maybe, in some small part of me, I still wanted to believe that there was safety in numbers. But in the end, I knew it was futile. No one could help me. No one could protect me from what lay beyond the trees. We stood at the edge of the forest again, the familiar outline of the trees before us. The air was thick with tension, the scent of pine and earth hanging heavy. I could feel the pull again, like an invisible hand at my back, urging me to step forward. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to mask it with a shaky smile. I didn't answer at first. Instead, I just stared at the trees, wondering if I was truly ready for whatever lay beyond them. But the truth was, I had no choice. It was the only way forward. I could never escape it until I faced it, and I wasn't about to let the forest win. "Let's go," I said quietly. Together, we crossed the threshold, stepping into the darkness once again. The trees closed in around us as we walked deeper into the woods. The path seemed different this time. It was darker, more oppressive, like it had shifted since my last journey. The once familiar rustling of leaves now felt like whispers, like the forest itself was speaking to us, warning us, or perhaps inviting us. We walked in silence, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened, what I had seen, what I had almost become. The trees, the shadows, the thing that had almost taken my life, they were all still here, still watching. But this time, it wasn't just me who felt it. She could sense it too. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I stopped, listening carefully. There was a sound like a faint hum in the distance. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, vibrating through the air, like the stones had before. The forest wasn't just alive, it was alive in a way I didn't understand. "It's like something is calling to us," she murmured. I nodded. though I wasn't sure she was ready to understand. It wasn't a call I wanted to answer, but we were here now, and there was no turning back. We kept walking, and the deeper we went, the heavier the air became. The shadows pressed in closer until I could feel them on my skin. Every step felt like a choice, a commitment to something I couldn't explain, something that wasn't human, wasn't natural. The forest was a world of its own, a place where time and space didn't seem to follow the same rules. And then, just as I thought we might be getting closer to the heart of it, I heard a sound behind us. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. But when I turned, there was no one there. I couldn't help but shiver. It had begun again. There was no escape. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a part of us now, a part of everything. It would never let us go. And so, as we continued walking deeper into the dark heart of the woods, I realized that this wasn't just a story. This wasn't just something that could be told and forgotten. It was a warning, a curse, and a reflection of the world beyond what we could see. It was a late autumn afternoon when I set out on what I thought would be a peaceful solo adventure, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. I had been yearning for a break from the constant noise and demands of everyday life. So I packed my bags, grabbed my trusty backpack, and headed off into the wilderness. The location? A secluded forest in the foothills of the mountains. I had heard stories about the area, tales of strange happenings, eerie sounds in the night, and sightings of mysterious figures, but I didn't pay much mind to them. After all, I wasn't there to get involved in anything out of the ordinary. My goal was simple: disconnect from technology, breathe in the fresh air, and enjoy a few days of solitude. I arrived at the edge of the forest as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the dense trees. The crisp fall air filled my lungs, and I couldn't help but smile at the peace I was finally experiencing. There was something about being alone in nature that always grounded me, made me feel smaller, and at the same time, part of something much bigger. As I began walking along the narrow path, the sounds of the outside world started to fade away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. The forest was alive, but it felt as though it had been waiting for me. I made my way deeper into the woods, feeling more and more like an outsider venturing into a forgotten world. The forest was thick here, with towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The ground was soft, covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves and moss. As the evening wore on, the temperature dropped, and I knew I had to find a suitable spot to camp before the darkness fully set in. I found a clearing, with just enough space to set up my tent, and decided that it would do for the night. As I gathered firewood and prepared my camp, I thought back to the stories I had heard about this place. The locals spoke of strange occurrences, but I dismissed them as nothing more than superstition. I was here to enjoy the outdoors, not to get involved in any paranormal nonsense. Still, as the sun disappeared completely and the night crept in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I started the fire, the flames crackling and dancing in the dark. The warmth was comforting, but the darkness beyond the firelight seemed to stretch endlessly. I sat down on a nearby log and pulled out some snacks, letting the silence of the forest surround me. The only sounds were the occasional snap of twigs underfoot and the soft wind rustling the leaves. The solitude felt comforting at first, but as the hours passed, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. It wasn't anything overt, no loud noises, no strange movements, but a feeling. A sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I shrugged it off. It was just the woods, I told myself. The night was drawing in, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I decided to turn in for the night and climb into my tent. I unzipped the door, crawled inside, and zipped myself up in the cozy space. The forest outside was still, too still. My breath was the only sound in the small tent, and I tried to settle into sleep, focusing on the crackling of the fire that I left outside. But it wasn't long before I heard it, a faint, barely perceptible sound. A snap, just like a twig breaking underfoot, but no one was outside. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. There it was again, a rustling sound from the bushes just beyond my campsite. The fire was still going strong, but the shadows seemed to stretch farther now, as though the night had grown darker in the blink of an eye. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. It was just nature, I reasoned. Still, the sound seemed too deliberate, too close. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, and for the first time, I realized how truly alone I was out here. I peeked through the flap of my tent, scanning the darkened edge of the campsite. The fire flickered, casting long shadows, but there was no movement. I waited, tension building in my chest, but the forest was quiet again. I tried to dismiss the feeling. After all, I wasn't a nervous person. But the thought lingered in my mind, the unmistakable sense that something wasn't right. I had read about people hearing things out in the woods, minds playing tricks, but this felt different. Something was out there. I lay back down in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, my mind racing. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal, a gust of wind, or even my own imagination getting the better of me. But even as I repeated these thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. The night stretched on, and I lay there in the dark, the crackling fire outside offering little comfort. I tried to sleep, but the unease grew with each passing minute, until I finally drifted off into an uneasy slumber, my dreams filled with shadows that seemed too real. As the night wore on, I tossed and turned in my sleeping bag, struggling to find a comfortable position. The forest was still, too still. It wasn't the kind of peaceful stillness you get during a calm night. It was unnerving. The usual chorus of crickets and night creatures was missing, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in from all sides. I kept telling myself it was just the novelty of being in an unfamiliar place, but deep down, I felt something was off. I must have drifted into a light sleep at some point, but it wasn't restful. The strange sounds outside my tent had kept me on edge. Every little rustle or snap of a twig made my heart race. I told myself I was being paranoid, but something inside me couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive in a way I didn't understand. I woke up suddenly, not from a dream, but from a feeling. Something had changed. The fire outside had burned down to embers, leaving the campsite bathed in soft, flickering light. The dark, however, seemed deeper now. The trees, now towering over me, blocked out even the moonlight. The air felt colder, heavier. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess. That's when I heard it again, the sound of something moving just outside my tent. Not an animal, not a casual rustling of leaves, but the deliberate steps of something heavier. It was slow, cautious, as though it were testing the ground before moving forward. My heart began to pound. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, and my skin went cold with a chill that wasn't from the night air. I sat frozen, listening intently. The sound stopped. I held my breath, hoping it would just go away, but it didn't. There was no wind, no other sounds, just that odd, unsettling silence. I grabbed my flashlight and, with trembling hands, unzipped the door of the tent. I had to know what was out there. I pointed the beam of light into the dark, scanning the clearing. For a few long seconds, all I saw was the dark void of the forest stretching into the distance, untouched, empty. I stood up, my feet crunching softly on the ground as I stepped out of the tent. The light from the dying fire illuminated the area around me in soft orange and deep shadows. My eyes darted around, trying to catch any movement. I felt exposed, standing there alone, vulnerable. The sound had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me from the edge of the clearing. I swung the flashlight around. the beam of light cutting through the darkness, illuminating only the trees, the scattered leaves, and the occasional distant silhouette of a branch swaying gently in the wind. I checked the fire, which was now reduced to a few flickering embers. It wasn't much, and I debated stoking it back up, but I didn't want to seem like I was trying to cover up something. The Denny's nodded at me. I was about to step back into the tent when I noticed something strange. A series of footprints in the dirt. They weren't animal tracks, not like the ones I had seen earlier. These were larger, human-like, but the way they were arranged seemed off. The steps weren't consistent, almost as if whoever or whatever had made them was walking in an erratic pattern. I knelt down, my flashlight casting long shadows on the ground, and traced the footprints with my finger. The soil was soft here, and the impression was deep, but not as deep as it should have been for something heavy. I pulled my hand back, my stomach dropping. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be seeing this. I looked up, scanning the forest again. The feeling of being watched intensified, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, making the branches creak and sway, but I didn't feel any comfort from the breeze. In fact, it made the night feel even colder, like the forest was alive and waiting for me to make the wrong move. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. I had to get back inside the tent. Whatever had left those footprints, I didn't want to find out what it was. I hurried back into the tent, zipped it shut, and tried to calm myself. My hands shook as I fumbled with my gear, and the flashlight slipped from my grip, clattering against the floor of the tent. I breathed deeply, trying to steady myself, but my mind kept replaying the strange footprints I had found. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. Lying back down, I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me, hoping the warmth would offer some comfort. But as the minutes passed, the weight of the silence grew heavier. I could still hear the occasional rustle from the forest, but it wasn't the familiar sounds of nature. It was different. It was as though something was moving just out of reach, something deliberately staying hidden from view. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. It lingered, pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, just as I thought I might drift off to sleep, I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps, slowly, methodically approaching the tent. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were unmistakable now, close enough that I could almost hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. I could feel the ground beneath me vibrating slightly with each step, as though something heavy was drawing near. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I call out? Should I confront whatever was out there? But I knew deep down that I wasn't ready for whatever it was. I wasn't prepared to face whatever had been haunting me since I first set foot in the woods. I lay there, frozen, hoping the thing outside would go away. But it didn't. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent, and for a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. No more rustling, no more movement. It was as if the forest itself had gone still, holding its breath. Then, just as I thought I might go mad from the waiting, I heard something else. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It wasn't like any whisper I had ever heard before. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but a sound that seemed to come from the air itself, filling the space around me. My heart pounded in my chest. The whisper didn't make sense. It wasn't words I could understand, just a strange, low hum that seemed to crawl under my skin. The sound lingered, vibrating in my bones, and I could feel my breath catching in my throat. I had no idea what to do, how to respond. The sensation of being watched was overpowering, and the forest outside felt as though it were closing in around me. The whispers continued, but they were getting louder, more insistent, as though they were trying to communicate something I couldn't understand. I clutched the edges of my sleeping bag, staring into the darkness of the tent, feeling more and more trapped as the minutes stretched on. There was no escaping this. The forest had a hold on me now, and I was powerless to stop it. The footsteps had stopped. The whispers faded. But something had shifted in the air, something darker. Something was in the woods with me, and it wasn't going to let me leave easily. The days that followed the strange footsteps outside my tent were a blur of unease and sleepless nights. The forest, once so inviting and serene, now felt like a suffocating prison. It was as if the trees themselves had grown darker, their shadows deeper, their branches more tangled, and the ground more treacherous. Every step I took was met with a soft crunch of dead leaves, a constant reminder that I was not alone. I tried to brush off the earlier events, telling myself it was just the stress of being alone in the woods. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The silence that hung in the air during the day felt thick, oppressive, like it was watching and waiting for me to make a mistake. By the third day, the strangeness had increased. I had tried to explore a little further from camp, hoping to clear my mind. But every time I ventured too far into the forest, I could feel the tension building. There were the occasional sounds, ones I had come to dread, the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, as if something was following my every move. One afternoon, I decided to investigate the area around the camp more thoroughly. I had found that the footprints from the previous night had disappeared by morning, leaving no trace of whatever had been there. They had left a mark on my mind, a feeling of dread that wouldn't go away. I grabbed my backpack and set off in the direction where I had seen the footprints, moving cautiously. The trees were tall, their trunks thick and knotted, and the underbrush was dense, making it hard to move quickly. The air was thick with humidity, and each step seemed to sink into the soft soil beneath me. I kept my flashlight in hand, although the sun was still high in the sky. The shadows were long, stretching across the ground in strange, contorted shapes. As I moved deeper into the forest, the air began to change. It felt colder, heavier, and the sound of the wind grew quieter, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The further I walked, the more I felt like something was watching me. I stopped occasionally, trying to listen, trying to determine if the forest was as empty as it appeared. That's when I noticed something new. It wasn't obvious at first, but as I scanned the ground, I saw them more footprints. But these weren't like the ones I had seen near the tent. These were fresher, as if they had been made only hours ago. They were erratic, uneven, as though the person, or whatever it was moving quickly, almost frantically. I crouched down to examine them, my heart beginning to race. The marks in the soil were deep, too deep for an animal. They didn't match any creature I recognized. They weren't human either, not completely. The stride was uneven, with one print significantly larger than the other, almost as if it was dragging something behind it. I took a few steps forward, the tension in my chest growing with each passing second. I had the distinct feeling that I was being led somewhere, drawn deeper into the woods. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees now standing like silent sentinels, watching my every move. The air was thick, and each breath felt heavier, like I was inhaling something that didn't belong. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the beam of light illuminated something in the distance. A figure? No, it couldn't be. I blinked, but it was gone, swallowed up by the shadows. I cursed under my breath, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I continued forward, more cautiously now. The further I went, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. It was as if the air itself was thickening, growing heavier with each step I took. The sound of my footsteps was muffled, like the ground was swallowing them whole. I tried to focus on the footprints, but they were becoming harder to follow. The forest floor was uneven, with roots protruding from the soil, and the leaves had started to become denser, making it difficult to see where I was stepping. The silence, though, was the most unsettling part. I had grown used to the ambient noise of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals. But now there was nothing, not even the breeze. I felt my pulse quicken, and I stopped, trying to listen. That's when I heard a soft sound, almost imperceptible, like a distant hum or a low, vibrating noise. It wasn't like anything I had heard before. It wasn't the wind or any animal I knew. It seemed to come from all around me, as though the forest itself was resonating with some unseen force. I spun around, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing. The trees stood still, their leaves unmoving in the unnatural quiet. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I should have turned back then. I should have returned to camp, packed up, and left. But something inside me, something deep in my gut, told me that I had to go further. I wasn't alone. I knew that much now. I pushed forward, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. The landscape around me was starting to change too. The trees were growing taller and closer together, the branches twisted and gnarled, blocking out the light. The forest had become denser, darker, as if I had entered another world entirely. It felt unnatural, wrong. I moved through the thicket, each step more deliberate than the last. And then, finally, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A clearing! I had stumbled upon it without meaning to. The trees opened up into a wide circular space, the ground covered in soft moss. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone. It was ancient looking, worn smooth by time, but there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The stone was etched with strange symbols, symbols that I had never seen before. They seemed to pulse faintly, glowing in the dim light that filtered through the canopy above. The air in the clearing felt different, almost charged with energy. I moved closer, my feet crunching softly on the moss. The closer I got to the stone, the more intense the hum became. It vibrated in my chest, making it hard to breathe. The sound seemed to be coming from the stone itself, as though it were alive, resonating with some ancient force. I reached out a trembling hand toward the stone, my fingers brushing the surface. The moment I touched it, a jolt of energy shot through me, like electricity running through my veins. I gasped, stumbling backward, my heart racing. My head spun, and the world around me seemed to tilt. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind, but the sensation wouldn't go away. The forest, the stone, the very air around me, it all felt like it was closing in. Something was trying to pull me in, something ancient, something powerful. I stumbled back, the hum in my ears growing louder. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I froze. I wasn't alone anymore. From the darkness of the trees, a figure stepped into the clearing. Tall, gaunt, with long, pale limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its eyes glowed faintly, an eerie, otherworldly light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was watching me. The world around me seemed to distort as the figure slowly took a step toward me. My body screamed for me to run, but my legs were frozen in place. The air had thickened to the point where I could barely breathe. The figure's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt as though I was trapped in its gaze, unable to break free. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the trees, melting back into the shadows. The forest was silent once more, but the pressure in the air remained. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the hum in my ears still ringing. I didn't care what was chasing me, what had just revealed itself. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. I had no idea how long I had been running. Time felt irrelevant as I sprinted through the forest, my legs burning with exhaustion and fear. The woods, once familiar, now felt like an alien landscape, a maze designed to trap me. The trees loomed over me like twisted giants, their branches blocking out any hint of light. The oppressive silence around me was suffocating, and all I could hear was the frantic beating of my own heart. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest heaving as I tried to push myself further, faster. But no matter how hard I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on me. I wasn't just being followed anymore. It felt as if the forest itself was alive, its roots reaching out to grab me, the trees bending to trap me in their grip. I stumbled over a root, falling to the ground with a harsh thud. My palm scraped against the rough earth, and I cursed under my breath, pushing myself back to my feet. But the moment I stood, I felt it, a cold gust of wind that seemed to come from nowhere, sharp and biting against my skin. It swept through the forest, rustling the leaves and carrying with it a low, mournful sound that sent a chill down my spine. I stood frozen, listening. The wind whispered through the trees again, but this time it wasn't just the wind. There was something else, something far darker. A low, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the forest. It was so close, so impossibly close, that I could feel the vibrations in my bones. Panic surged through me, and I turned on my heels, ready to run once more. But as I did, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the shadows. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. There, standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam, was the figure. The same tall, gaunt figure I had seen earlier. It was standing still, watching me with those glowing eyes, its face obscured by the shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My legs felt like lead. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away from it, but I couldn't. My feet were glued to the ground. I felt paralyzed by fear, as if the very air around me had turned to cement. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, its long, pale limbs stretching unnaturally as it closed the distance between us. I could see it more clearly now, the details sharper in the dim light. Its skin was pale and ashen, its bones visible beneath a thin layer of flesh, almost like it was made of nothing but shadows and remnants of the past. Its eyes, glowing a faint blue, were locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. And then it spoke. The voice was not a voice at all. It was a sound, a horrible, low hum that seemed to reverberate through the very core of my being. It didn't use words, but I understood. I could feel it in my mind, in my chest, a deep, unsettling presence that filled me with dread. "Leave," it said. But it wasn't a command. It was a warning. A promise of something far worse if I didn't obey. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but I was frozen in place, caught in the grip of something far stronger than fear. It was as if the forest itself was alive, and it had wrapped its tendrils around me, pulling me into its depths. The figure's eyes flickered, and in that moment, something changed. The air around me grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching across the ground like dark fingers reaching for me. I felt the weight of them, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I tried to move, but my body refused to cooperate. The figure stepped closer, and this time I saw something in its eyes, a flicker of recognition, a knowing. It wasn't just a creature of the forest. It was something ancient, something tied to this land, something that had been here long before I ever set foot in these woods. The hum grew louder, the sound vibrating in my chest as it filled the air around me. The figure raised one long, bony finger, pointing directly at me. And then I heard it, something deep, something primal, something that didn't belong in this world. The ground beneath me trembled. I felt it before I saw it. The trees around me began to shake, their trunks creaking and groaning as if they were alive, as if they were being forced to move. The leaves rustled violently, and the wind howled through the branches, carrying with it a cacophony of whispers, voices that I couldn't understand, but that seemed to speak directly to my soul. I looked around, terrified, as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The trees were shifting, their branches twisting and turning like dark serpents, and the ground itself seemed to be pulling away from me, as if it were trying to swallow me whole. The figure in front of me was no longer alone. Behind it, emerging from the shadows, were more shapes, more figures, tall and pale, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. They moved closer, encircling me, and I realized with a cold, sickening clarity that I was trapped. The world spun, and I stumbled backward, my legs finally able to move. But there was nowhere to go. The figures had surrounded me, and the forest had closed in. The trees seemed to lean inward, their twisted branches blocking out any hope of escape. I could hear the voices now, louder, more frantic, more desperate. They were speaking to me, calling to me, but I couldn't make sense of the words. They were a jumble of noise, a haunting chorus that filled the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was closer now, its face no longer hidden in the shadows. I could see it clearly. Its features were distorted, twisted, as if it had once been human, but was no longer. Its eyes glowed brighter now, like twin pools of blue fire, and its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. I could feel it in my bones, in my very soul. It was reaching into me, pulling at something deep inside me, something I didn't understand. The world around me seemed to dissolve, and I felt myself being drawn in, pulled toward the figure like a moth to a flame. I screamed. I screamed louder than I ever had in my life, but no sound came out. My mouth opened, but it was as if the very air had turned to stone, suffocating me, choking me. The figures closed in, their eyes glowing with that terrible blue light. The whispers grew louder. The forest itself seemed to howl in anger and hunger, and I felt my strength draining away, my mind unraveling in the darkness. But then I touched my face, and the reality of it hit me like a punch to the gut. My skin was clammy, damp with sweat, and there was something heavy on my chest, a weight that made it hard to breathe. I reached up to touch my throat, and that's when I noticed the marks, deep, red scratches running across my neck, as if something had dug into my skin with claws. A sudden jolt of terror rushed through me. The marks were real. I wasn't dreaming. What I had experienced was no figment of my imagination. I sat up quickly, surveying my surroundings. The forest lay ahead, dark and uninviting. But now there was no sign of the figures. No glowing eyes, no strange hums or eerie whispers. There was nothing except the normal sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional crack of a twig breaking under the weight of some unseen animal. I stood, my legs shaking, my body sore from the run I had made in the dark. There was a dull ache in my bones, a feeling as if I had been through a battle. And in a way, I had. But what was the battle? Who or what had I been fighting? I turned back toward the forest, looking for any sign of the figures, the creature, the horrible presence that had surrounded me. But there was nothing. The forest was silent, peaceful even. There was no sign of the malevolent force that had nearly driven me to madness just hours before. I began to walk, my steps hesitant at first, as if the ground itself might shift beneath me, pulling me back into the nightmare. But the more I walked, the more I began to question what had really happened. Could it have been real? Could it have all been some sort of hallucination brought on by fear and isolation? But the pain in my neck, the scratches, the bruises on my arms, the tightness in my chest told me otherwise. I had been touched by something that didn't belong in this world. The trees behind me seemed to watch, the dark trunks towering like silent sentinels. I wanted to leave, to get as far away from the forest as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that wasn't ready to let me go. By the time I reached the edge of the meadow, I was nearly running. I didn't care where I was headed anymore, I just needed to get away. The town was a few miles from here. I had to make it there. I had to find someone who could explain what had happened, who could tell me that I wasn't insane. But deep down, I knew better. No one would believe me. No one could. The feeling of being hunted didn't leave me, though. It was in the pit of my stomach, gnawing at me, telling me that the forest wasn't done with me yet. The figures, the dark presence, whatever they weren't gone. They were just waiting, biding their time, watching. The air felt thick again, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on me, but I didn't stop. I pushed forward, my footsteps quickening, my pulse racing. I reached the road just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land. The warm glow of the fading light was a welcome relief, a reminder that there was still some good in the world. I flagged down a passing car, desperate to get away from the forest. The driver, an older man with a concerned look, stopped and rolled down his window. "You all right, son?" he asked. eyeing me with suspicion. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't know how to answer. The words stuck in my throat, tangled with fear and uncertainty. I wanted to scream at him, tell him what I had seen, what I had been through. But I knew he wouldn't believe me. No one would. "I'm fine," I said finally, my voice hoarse. Just need to get out of here." He didn't press further, just gave me a long look before nodding. "All right. Hop in. I'll take you into town." The ride was silent, the only sound the hum of the engine as we drove away from the forest. My gaze kept drifting back to the trees, to the dark shadows looming in the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe, that something was still out there, waiting. By the time we reached town, the sun had completely set, and the stars were beginning to appear in the night sky. I thanked the driver and got out of the car, walking quickly to the nearest diner. I needed food, I needed rest, and most of all, I needed to forget. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. As I sat down at a booth, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of me, I realized something that chilled me to my core. The forest hadn't let go of me. I could still feel its presence, its pull, like a faint whisper in the back of my mind. The scratches on my neck throbbed with each passing moment, a constant reminder of what I had encountered. And then I saw a figure, standing across the street in the shadows. Tall, gaunt, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. The figure from the woods. I froze, my blood running cold, and watched as it disappeared into the darkness, vanishing into the night. I left the diner immediately, not even bothering to pay. I didn't care. I didn't care about anything anymore. I just needed to get away. I don't know where I'm going now. I don't know how to outrun what's following me. The forest is still out there, and I can feel it, waiting for me, lurking just out of sight. The marks on my neck haven't faded. The air still feels thick, heavy. I can hear the whispers sometimes, faint but persistent, calling to me from the distance. I don't know what they want, but I know this. They're not done with me. They'll never be done with me. And now, as I sit here, I can hear them again, the voices growing louder, closer. Maybe the only way to escape them is to keep moving. Maybe if I never stop, I'll outrun them. But deep down, I know that's not the answer. Because whatever they are, wherever they're from, they're never truly gone. And they'll be waiting for me when I stop running. I've spent countless nights now on the move, never staying in one place for too long. It's as if my life has become a blur of motels, gas stations, and half-empty roads leading to nowhere. I try not to look over my shoulder, but I can feel their presence, that cold weight on my chest. I still hear the whispers in the wind. I still feel the chill of their eyes, watching me from the shadows. It's like they've marked me, and no matter where I go, they follow, lurking in the corners of my mind, always just out of reach, but never truly gone. I keep telling myself that I'm fine, that everything that happened, the forest, the figures, the eerie glow in the night, was just a product of my imagination. Fear can play tricks on the mind, after all. But every time I try to dismiss it, I remember the marks on my neck, the way the air shifted, the suffocating darkness that pressed in on me from all sides. I remember the way I felt when I ran when I thought I might die, and how, even now, it feels as if the forest is still there, waiting for me to return. At times, I even catch myself wondering if I was meant to stay. Was the forest trying to claim me? Was it trying to force me into its fold, to make me one of its shadows? And yet, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that cursed place, I know deep down that I'll never really escape it. Maybe that's the cruelest part of this whole nightmare, the fact that it's not over. It never was. I can still hear the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind picks up, or the way the trees seem to whisper my name when I pass them. Sometimes, when I stop long enough to think, I feel their eyes on me. The trees themselves, the very earth that holds them, have become a constant presence. I don't trust the forest anymore. I don't trust the night. But I keep moving, because what else is there to do? I've tried to forget. I've tried to live a normal life again. I've tried to find peace, but the forest has burned itself into my mind in ways I can't explain. The scratch marks on my neck haven't faded, even though months have passed. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, my heart racing, as if I'm still running through those woods. As if I can still feel the darkness creeping up behind me, the sharp claws brushing my skin, just inches away from dragging me back into the nightmare. I've thought about confronting it, about going back to the forest, hoping that by facing it, I could finally end this, put it to rest once and for all. But every time the thought crosses my mind, a cold wave of terror washes over me. The forest doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. It consumes. I learned that the hard way. They never told me about places like that. No one warned me that there were places in the world where the darkness wasn't just metaphorical. I never thought I'd stumble across something like that, something so twisted and real. Now, I know better. It's a lonely existence now. I've cut ties with anyone who might care. No one would understand. How could they? How could anyone who hasn't seen what I've seen, felt what I've felt, ever believe in something like this? There are moments, though, in the dead of night when I wonder if I'll ever truly be free. Sometimes I catch myself thinking that maybe the forest is a metaphor, a manifestation of my own fears and regrets, creeping into my mind like an insidious disease. But I can't ignore the memories, the vivid, terrifying memories that cling to me like a second skin. And then there's the figure. The one I saw across the street that night. The one whose eyes still haunt me, even now, no matter how far I've run. I don't know what it wants or why it came after me, but I know that it's not finished. I know that the shadow, the thing that haunted me in that forest, is still out there. Maybe it's not even about me anymore. Maybe it wants to claim something bigger, something more. Or maybe it just wants to watch. I don't know what its endgame is, but I can feel it. It's like the slow ticking of a clock, building up to something I can't see. And as much as I try to push it out of my mind, I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me again. The thing in the woods, the thing that chased me, that nearly took me, won't let me go. It never will. Sometimes, when I'm sitting in a diner or standing in line at a gas station, I see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye. I'll turn quickly, expecting to catch a glimpse of the figure, but there's nothing. It's always just a trick of the light, or maybe my overactive imagination. But there's still that feeling, that cold sensation crawling up the back of my neck, telling me I'm being watched. And when the wind picks up, when the trees sway just a little too much, I hear it. That whisper. It's faint, barely there, but it's enough to make my heart race. Enough to make me question everything I've come to believe about the world. I can't shake the feeling that it's calling me back, calling me to the forest. I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. I was one of those people who saw the world in black and white, logical, scientific, and grounded. But what happened to me one cold night in the abandoned hospital is something I still can't explain. I'd never believed in ghosts, but now, I'm not so sure. This all started back in the late fall, around November, in a small town on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't a well-known place, just a few scattered houses, a general store, and one large, old hospital building that had been out of use for decades. It wasn't much to look at. The hospital had been shut down when the newer one was built in the city center, and over the years, the town had simply grown around it. People often said the place was haunted, but those were just rumors until the night I decided to prove them wrong. One evening, as I was walking home from work, a few of the locals had gathered outside the diner, talking about the hospital. They always did this. It was almost a rite of passage for new people in town. They would gather at the diner, have their coffee, and share the same tired old stories. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the windows. Some said they had heard footsteps echoing down the empty halls. Most brushed it off as local lore, but something in the way they spoke made me curious. I was never one for ghost stories, but there was something unsettling about their eyes when they spoke of the hospital. It was as if they were sharing a secret, something they didn't want to be true, but couldn't ignore. I had never seen the building myself. It was a few blocks away from the main street, behind a set of overgrown trees and a cracked iron fence. That evening, I decided to take a walk toward it. It wasn't far, and the night air was cool, perfect for a stroll. The old hospital loomed like a shadow in the distance, its windows dark, like hollow eyes staring into nothingness. I could hear the rustling of leaves as I approached the perimeter, the tall trees almost concealing the structure. I hadn't expected much. Maybe I would see the place from a distance and move on, but as I stood there, peering through the gaps in the iron fence, I felt something, an odd sensation that I couldn't explain. It was like the air around the building was heavier, thicker, as if something was pressing down on me. I didn't want to stick around too long. A cold shiver ran up my spine, and I felt the urge to turn back, but I stayed rooted to the spot for a moment longer. The moonlight illuminated the facade of the hospital, casting strange shadows across the broken windows and crumbling brick. It was eerie, but nothing that couldn't be explained by the passage of time. I shrugged off the feeling and began walking away, telling myself that the stories I'd heard were nothing more than small-town legends. People liked to gossip, and with nothing better to do, I figured they had created their own version of a haunted history. I was wrong. Little did I know that that night would set in motion a series of events that would change everything I believed about the world. What started as a casual curiosity about an old, abandoned building soon spiraled into something far darker. And it all began that night, when I first decided to walk past that old hospital and ignore the warnings of the townsfolk. The next few days were calm, and I thought nothing more of it. I continued with my work, talked with the locals, and carried on with my daily routine. But there was always this lingering thought in the back of my mind. There was something off about that place, something I couldn't shake. It wasn't until a few days later, when I went back for another walk, that I realized just how far down the rabbit hole I was about to go. The hospital wasn't just a building. It was a door to something much more sinister. A few nights after my first encounter with the hospital, I found myself back in the same area. It wasn't something I'd planned, it just sort of happened. I had finished my shift at the diner earlier than expected, and, with nothing to do, I found myself walking again toward the hospital. The town was quiet, the streets nearly empty, except for the occasional car passing by. The air had turned chilly, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself as I walked, my boots clicking against the pavement. I told myself I was just being curious. I wasn't scared, and there was no reason to be. The place was abandoned, just an old building. But as I approached the overgrown path leading to the fence, that familiar feeling settled over me again, the one I couldn't quite explain. I stood there for a few moments, looking at the darkened windows of the hospital. It wasn't like I had ever seen a ghost or anything like that, but there was something unsettling about the stillness. It felt as if the building was alive in some way, watching. I took a deep breath and decided to walk closer, edging around the perimeter of the hospital. The ground was uneven, the grass long and untended. It was clear that no one had bothered to care for this place for years. A few broken windows caught my eye, some of them completely shattered, with shards of glass still clinging to the frame like jagged teeth. There were strange markings on the walls, faded graffiti, and what looked like the remnants of old posters peeling off the brickwork. Then, something caught my attention. The sound of footsteps. I froze. At first, I thought it was just the wind or perhaps the rustling of the trees nearby. But as I stood there, listening, I could hear them clearly, distinct, heavy footsteps on the gravel. Not too far from me, behind the hospital, where no one should have been. I looked around, scanning the area. There was no one else. The street was empty, and the only noise I could hear was the soft whistle of the wind. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the stories from the locals get to me. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, as if someone was walking closer to me. My heart started to race, and I took a step back, my eyes locked on the darkened path behind the building. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there frozen, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I shook my head and tried to brush off the growing unease. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself. Maybe it was just some kind of noise that I couldn't explain. But as the footsteps came even closer, I knew in my gut that this wasn't normal. This wasn't something I could easily write off. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Just like that. And for a moment, the silence was so thick that I could almost hear my heartbeat. I held my breath, waiting for anything to break the stillness. But there was nothing. No more footsteps, no sounds of movement, just the wind and the rustling of the leaves. I slowly turned around and walked away from the fence, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to come back here again. Not tonight. I went home and tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just the eerie atmosphere of the old building playing tricks on my mind. But something about the experience lingered. It stayed with me long after I had gone to bed that night, the memory of the footsteps echoing in my mind. The next morning, I went about my usual routine, serving coffee at the diner, chatting with the regulars, trying to keep my mind off of what had happened. But when I saw a familiar face walk through the door, one of the older gentlemen who'd been there the night I'd overheard the stories about the hospital, he stopped by my table, his face grim. "You know," he said, his voice low, "I saw you walking around the hospital the other night." I froze, my hands stilling on the coffee pot. How did he know? "You're not the first one," he continued. "The place plays tricks on you. People see things, hear things that aren't there. Sometimes it's just the mind, but sometimes it's something else, something that doesn't belong." I tried to play it cool, not wanting to show any hint of fear, but his words made my stomach drop. He went on to tell me more about the history of the hospital, how it was once a thriving medical center, but there had been whispers of strange happenings, unexplained deaths, and rumors of patients disappearing in the night. The place had a dark reputation, one that had been passed down through generations. And now, it seemed, it was alive with memories of its past. "You have to be careful, son," he said. "It's not a place you want to visit if you value your peace of mind. The hospital doesn't let go of people easily." I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside I was a mess. What had I gotten myself into? The more I thought about it, the more I felt the weight of his words. The footsteps I had heard were no longer just a strange coincidence, they were a warning. Something was in that hospital, and it was waiting for me. That night, I didn't go near the hospital. I stayed home, keeping the curtains drawn and the lights on. But the next day, something unexpected happened. I received a call at work. The voice on the other end was low and crackling, as if coming from a great distance. "Hello," I said, confused. "Who is this?" There was a long pause, and then the voice spoke. "You shouldn't be going near that place." The call cut off abruptly, and I was left staring at the phone in my hand, unsure of what had just happened. Who had called? How did they know? The voice didn't sound familiar, and there was no number on the caller ID. But one thing was certain, the warning was real. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just let this go. Whatever was happening at that hospital, I had to know. Something was pulling me back, drawing me toward the building once again. But this time, I wasn't going to walk in blindly. The next few days were a blur, but the pull to the hospital was undeniable. I had to go back. The days following that strange phone call were like a slow descent into madness. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that dark hospital loomed behind my eyelids, like a shadow I couldn't shake. The footsteps I had heard, the unsettling words from the old man at the diner, they had all been too real, too vivid to just ignore. It felt as if something was waiting, watching, and I had no choice but to return and face it head on. I had to know the truth. It wasn't long before I found myself walking toward the hospital again. This time, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. My feet carried me down the familiar path. though every step felt heavier, as if the air itself was growing thicker, more oppressive. The wind had picked up that evening, the rustling of the trees louder than before. The smell of damp earth and decay clung to the air, making it difficult to breathe. But still, I pressed on, the towering silhouette of the hospital growing closer with every step. I was alone this time, no friends to accompany me, no distractions. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, but I was determined to face whatever lay behind those crumbling walls. The thought of leaving unanswered questions gnawed at me, pushing me further. As I reached the rusted gate that marked the entrance, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, an odd flicker of light in one of the upper windows. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A soft glow that contrasted against the thickening darkness around me. I told myself it was just a reflection from the nearby street lamps, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. No one had been in this building for years. The power had been cut off long ago, so how could there be any light? Without thinking, I made my way around the side of the hospital, drawn to the back entrance where I had seen the flicker. The place looked even more desolate up close, the ivy and vines that had grown over the stone like an attempt to bury the building alive. The air was colder now, the temperature dropping rapidly, and I shivered despite my jacket. My breath formed small clouds in the air as I moved toward the back door, which was slightly ajar. It was then that I noticed another strange detail, a faint smell. It wasn't like the usual dampness of abandoned buildings. It was something far more unsettling. It was a sour, metallic scent, as if something had been left to rot for far too long. I hesitated at the door, unsure if I should push forward, but the need to know what was going on in that place was stronger than any fear. I pushed the door open, the rusty hinges creaking in protest. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, but I steeled myself and stepped inside. The interior of the hospital was just as I had remembered, dark, cold, and untouched by time. The smell of mildew and old wood mixed with the stench of something far worse. The air was stale, heavy with dust and decay. The faint glow I had seen from outside came from the far end of the hallway, where a single light bulb flickered erratically, casting strange shadows along the peeling walls. It illuminated just enough for me to see the outlines of abandoned equipment, a gurney here, a cracked mirror, their forgotten relics of a time long past. I swallowed hard, my heart racing, and moved forward, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The flickering light seemed to pull me in, urging me to come closer. I kept my eyes fixed on it, refusing to look anywhere else, but the further I walked, the more the feeling of unease grew. It was as though the building itself was alive, its silence an eerie presence that surrounded me. As I rounded the corner, the light stopped flickering and remained steady. For a moment, I thought maybe I had been wrong, that the place wasn't as strange as I had made it out to be. But as I reached the source of the light, I froze. The door in front of me was wide open. Inside, the room was bare, save for a single chair positioned in the center. The chair was old, worn, and completely out of place, its legs creaking as though it had been moved recently. And on the floor around it, something that could only be described as a stain, a dark, red-brown discoloration that was far too large to be an accident. I stepped closer, my stomach turning. The sight of it made my head spin, and I had to fight the urge to run. The smell of blood, thick and nauseating, assaulted my senses, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The room felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. I turned to leave, but stopped when I heard its soft, muffled footsteps coming from the hallway behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. No one was there. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued, growing closer, as though someone or something was moving toward me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as the footsteps grew louder, and that's when I saw it, just for a fraction of a second, a figure standing in the doorway across the hall, watching me. It was a shadow, tall and thin, its face obscured in the darkness. I couldn't make out any features, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Before I could react, the figure vanished into the shadows. I stood there frozen, my breath shallow, my pulse deafening in my ears. The temperature in the room had dropped even further, and I could see my breath now, thick clouds of vapor that floated in front of me like ghosts. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the darkened hallway, looking for any sign of movement. I needed to leave. I knew it, but my feet felt heavy, reluctant to carry me toward the door. The footsteps started again, but this time they were not behind me. They were in front of me, echoing down the hallway. Someone or something was walking toward me, and I had no choice but to face it. I didn't wait any longer. My legs finally obeyed, and I sprinted toward the exit, my heart hammering in my chest. The echo of those footsteps seemed to follow me, even as I pushed open the door and stumbled out into the night air. But even as I left the hospital grounds behind, I knew I hadn't escaped. The night air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as I stood in front of the dilapidated hospital, my breath shallow and erratic. I could still hear the echo of those footsteps in my mind, the ones that had followed me down the hallway. My hands trembled as I tried to steady myself, wiping the cold sweat from my brow. The image of the shadow in the doorway, that figure that had vanished as quickly as it appeared, haunted me. I couldn't shake it. It felt as though I hadn't truly escaped, that something was still out there, waiting. I told myself I needed to leave. I needed to get away from this place, to forget what I had seen, to return to some semblance of normality. But my feet refused to move. The wind had died down, leaving the night eerily silent. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. I glanced back at the entrance, knowing that someone was waiting for me inside. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but my curiosity won over my fear. I had to know what was going on. I had to face whatever it was that had been haunting me. With shaky steps, I turned and walked back toward the gate. This time, I wasn't just walking into the unknown, I was walking into the very heart of it. The door I had left ajar earlier was still open, its hinges creaking in protest as I pushed it further inward. The musty scent of the hospital wrapped around me once again, filling my nostrils and making my stomach turn. But I kept moving, unable to stop myself now, as though some unseen force was guiding me. I knew I was heading towards something, I could feel it. The building seemed alive in a way, the air thick with anticipation. My footsteps echoed through the long, empty hallways, each sound reverberating off the walls, adding to the feeling of isolation and dread. There was a heavy stillness in the air, an unnatural quiet that made my every move feel like a violation. As I made my way down the corridor, the familiar flickering light from the previous night caught my eye. It was still on, the dim glow casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. But this time, it wasn't just the light that caught my attention, it was the sound. Soft, almost inaudible at first, but growing louder with every passing moment, was the unmistakable sound of someone or something breathing. It was slow and deliberate, like a heavy exhale, followed by an eerie silence. My heart skipped a beat as I froze in place, trying to locate the source of the sound. The breath didn't sound human. It was far too deep, too unnatural. I turned the corner and found myself standing in front of the same room I had visited the previous night. The chair was still there, its worn legs creaking slightly as though it had just been moved. But this time, something was different. The dark stain on the floor was larger, more spread out, as though it had been growing over the course of the last few hours. The smell of blood and decay was stronger now, nearly overpowering. I took a hesitant step forward, my legs shaking beneath me. The breathing was louder now, more distinct, as if whatever it was right behind me. I dared not turn around. I couldn't. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. I felt the presence before I saw it, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. The room felt colder now, the air thick with the unmistakable stench of death. That was when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the flickering light, a figure stood. It was tall, shrouded in darkness, its features obscured by the shadows. For a moment, I thought it might be my mind playing tricks on me. But then, the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, as if it were aware of my every breath. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs felt frozen in place, unable to move, my heart hammering in my chest as the figure took a step closer. The air around me grew colder still, and I could see my breath misting in front of me, even as the figure inched closer and closer. It didn't speak. It didn't make a sound, but its presence was enough to fill the room with an unbearable tension. The breathing, that deep, unnatural exhale, seemed to be coming from the figure now. I could feel its cold, clammy presence just behind me, its intangible form brushing against my skin like a whisper. I dared not look back. The terror I felt was unlike anything I had experienced before. It wasn't just fear, it was an instinctual, primal terror, the kind that strikes at the very core of your being and refuses to let go. I tried to move, to take a step, but my body refused to respond. My legs trembled, my arms heavy at my sides. I wanted to run. I needed to run, but my feet wouldn't lift from the floor. And then it spoke. The voice was low, guttural, and filled with something I can't even begin to describe. It was as though it came from everywhere, from deep within the walls, from the very foundation of the building. "You shouldn't have come back," it said. The words were barely audible, yet they rang out in my head as though they had been shouted in my ears. The sound of it shattered the silence, sending a surge of terror through me. My breath caught in my throat, my chest tight with fear. I managed to turn, finally able to move my legs, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was closer now, standing just a few feet in front of me. Its face was obscured in shadow, but I could see the outline of its eyes, black, hollow, and full of something far darker than I could comprehend. It was watching me, studying me, its gaze penetrating deep into my soul. I backed away, my heart pounding, but it followed me. Step by agonizing step, it moved closer, its cold, empty eyes never leaving mine. The smell of death, of rot, grew stronger as it closed the distance between us. I knew in that moment that I had made a grave mistake. I had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. There was no way out, no escape. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room fell silent once more, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. I stood there, trembling, trying to process what had just happened. I stumbled backward, the oppressive silence of the room closing in around me like a vice. My heart was still racing, the rapid thudding of it deafening in my ears as I tried to gather myself. My chest felt tight, as though the air itself had thickened into something suffocating. The figure, the presence, whatever it had been, was gone now, vanished into the shadows without a trace. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, just out of sight, watching and waiting. I had to get out of here. The thought was like a mantra in my head, pushing me forward despite the overwhelming fear that still gripped me. My legs felt like lead as I turned and fled from the room, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways like an alarm. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to escape, to leave this forsaken place behind and never look back. But even as I ran, I knew that wasn't going to be possible. Something had changed, something had been set into motion that couldn't be undone. I made it to the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the handle, but when I pushed it open, I froze. The night outside wasn't the same as it had been when I arrived. The familiar stillness had given way to an unsettling chill, the air thick with a fog that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The buildings in the distance were obscured by the mist, their outlines barely visible in the pale light of the moon. It was as if the world itself had shifted, as if the hospital had become a gateway to something far darker than I could comprehend. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat as I looked back at the hospital behind me. There was nothing to see now, no figure standing in the doorway, no signs of the terror that had gripped me just moments before. The building stood silent and still, its shadowy silhouette a stark contrast to the fog that had begun to envelop everything around it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that it wasn't over. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and stepped into the fog. The cold seeped into my bones as I walked, the fog swirling around me like a living thing, creeping into my clothes and wrapping around my body. I could barely see where I was going, the world reduced to a vague blur of shadows and mist. The sounds of the city, the hum of distant traffic, had faded away entirely. The silence was absolute. And then I heard it. A soft, guttural noise, like a low growl, coming from somewhere behind me. My heart stopped in my chest. I spun around, my eyes wide with panic, but there was nothing, just the thick fog, swirling in every direction. The sound had stopped as quickly as it had started, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. I kept moving, faster now, not daring to look back. My feet pounded against the damp ground, my mind racing as I tried to process everything that had happened. The figure in the hospital, the breathing, the whispers in the darkness, it all felt like a dream or a nightmare, too vivid to be a simple trick of my imagination. I didn't know what was real anymore. As I approached the edge of the fog, I saw the faint outline of my car in the distance. Relief surged through me, my pace quickening. The sight of something familiar, something that represented safety, was enough to push me forward. The door to my car was within reach when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, crunching in the mist behind me. I didn't stop to look. I threw open the door and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me with a force that rattled the entire vehicle. My hands were still shaking as I fumbled with the keys, starting the engine with a sputter. I didn't wait for the car to warm up, didn't care that the engine was still rough. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and sped off, the tires screeching as I tore down the empty road. But even as I drove, even as the distance between me and the hospital grew, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The fog, thick and suffocating, seemed to cling to my rearview mirror, and I could feel eyes on the back of my neck, as if the darkness itself had reached out and grabbed hold of me. I drove for hours, never slowing down, never looking back. But no matter how far I went, no matter how many turns I took, it had taken root in my mind, in my soul, and I knew that no matter how far I ran, it would always be there, waiting to pull me back. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, its hollow eyes staring at me from the darkness. The sound of those footsteps, echoing in my mind, never stopped. And the whispers, those damn whispers, followed me, haunting me, even in the daylight. I tried to talk to people, to tell them what had happened, but no one believed me. They told me I was just stressed, just imagining things. But I knew the truth. I had seen it, I had felt it, and no matter how much I wanted to forget, I couldn't. Weeks went by, and I tried to resume my normal life. But it wasn't the same. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, lurking just out of sight, waiting to drag me back into the depths of that haunted place. And then, one evening, I received a call. It was from a friend, someone who had been with me during my investigation at the hospital. He sounded panicked, his voice trembling as he spoke. He said he had gone back to the hospital, that he had to know what was happening there. He said he had found something that I needed to see. But when I asked him what it was, the line went dead. I never saw him again. I still don't know what exactly happened that night, the night that changed everything. The night I thought I had escaped, the night I drove miles away from that place, only to find it still gnawing at me, at the edge of my thoughts, at the corners of my mind. The hospital was like a shadow, following me in my dreams, lurking in the back of my consciousness, refusing to be forgotten. It's been months since I fled from that forsaken building, yet I can't shake the feeling that I am no different than those who were lost within its walls. It feels like I've been marked somehow. No matter where I go or how hard I try to outrun the memory, it sticks to me like a damp fog that swallowed that hospital. I have never gone back to that place. I don't think I could even if I wanted to. Even just thinking about it now causes a shiver to crawl down my spine. But it doesn't matter, because I know that it's still there, lingering in the background of my life. When I tried to speak to people about it, they didn't understand. Most dismissed it as stress, or maybe even a fevered nightmare brought on by too many late nights. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I felt the presence in that room, saw the figure that shouldn't have been there, and the whispers that grew louder with each passing moment. It was real. I don't know if I can explain it, but it was real. I still wonder about my friend. He went back to the hospital, as I said. He wanted to uncover the truth, but that curiosity led him to vanish without a trace. I don't know if he is dead, if he's still out there somewhere, lost in that dark place, or if something worse happened to him. Maybe he found the answers he was looking for, but I can't shake the idea that it wasn't just a curiosity that drove him. It was something darker, something that was waiting for him, just like it had waited for me. The worst part is that I still don't know what it was. What had been haunting that hospital? What was that thing that had appeared before me, or the figure that stood in the hallway? Was it the ghost of someone who had passed? Or was it something else entirely? I will never know for sure, and that in itself is perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. Not knowing, not understanding. In the months since that night, I found myself more and more detached from the world. I don't feel truly connected to people anymore. I've tried to tell myself that I'm being irrational, that I should move on and focus on the present. But the truth is, I can't. I don't know if I ever will. I've tried looking up any information about the hospital, hoping to find an explanation. But all I've found are the same vague reports, the same rumors that float around any place abandoned long enough. Some say the hospital was built on land where dark things happened, land that held secrets no one should have uncovered. Others claim that it was just a simple institution, one of many that was closed down due to a lack of funding and interest. But I don't believe that. Whatever was in that building wasn't just a product of neglect. It was something far more sinister, something that felt alive in a way I can't explain. I still hear those footsteps, faint as they may be, every time I turn a corner or enter a dark room. I wonder if I'm truly free from the hospital, or if it's just lying in wait, biding its time until it decides to pull me back into its depths. People say that time heals all wounds. Maybe that's true, but not for me. The memory of that night still feels fresh, like it happened yesterday. And the more I try to forget, the more vivid it becomes. I can still see the halls of that hospital in my mind, the dark, twisting corridors, the oppressive air that weighed down on me. The place never really left me. I think about my friend, about how he wanted to discover the truth. Maybe he thought that if he went back, he could find the answers. I often wonder if that's why we're drawn to places like that, places that feel wrong, places that unsettle us. We want to understand them, to know what's hidden beneath the surface. But sometimes the truth is far worse than ignorance. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering what would happen if I went back. If I could somehow brave the place again and face whatever still waits inside. But I know better. I know that there are some places, some experiences, that shouldn't be revisited. Some things, once seen, should never be looked at again. And that hospital, whatever it was, belongs in the past, where it will stay, haunting the edges of my memory, but never crossing the line into the present. I've come to terms with the fact that I may never fully understand what happened that night. Maybe that's for the best. There are some things that should remain mysteries, left unanswered, sealed away. I know I'll never be the same. I've learned that some doors, once opened, can never be shut again. But even so, I can't help but wonder what if. And so, here I am, standing at the edge of something I'll never truly understand, forever haunted by the memory of that hospital. It's a place that will live on in my mind, always lingering, always waiting. And no matter how far I run, no matter how many years pass, I know it will never let me go. The hospital still calls to me, in the whispers of the wind, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. But I won't go back. I can't. It all started one ordinary evening, like any other. A typical Tuesday, or maybe it was a Wednesday. Does it really matter? To me, it was just another day in the hustle and bustle of my daily routine. I'm a guy in my late 20s, working at a small law office in the heart of the city. My life, like most, was a predictable cycle. I'd wake up early, catch the train, sit at my desk all day, and head back home to my small apartment in a part of the city that wasn't quite downtown, but wasn't far enough out to be peaceful either. I spent a lot of time on my phone, scrolling through endless feeds, and when I wasn't working or staring at a screen, I was lost in my thoughts. At the time, I had one thing I looked forward to every day: the ride up to my office floor. It might sound odd, but let me explain. The building I worked in had one of those old elevators, classic, creaky, and just enough character to make you wonder if it was safe. The kind of elevator you don't trust but use anyway because the stairs are inconvenient and you have to get to the top quickly. Then, of course, there was the person. I'd first seen them one afternoon, about a month into my routine. I had just finished my day at the office and was heading down for the night, like I always did. I hadn't thought much about the person at first. They were just someone else waiting for the elevator. They were standing near the corner, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the doors as they slowly slid open. That was all until the next time. Over the next few days, the person started showing up more frequently. Every time I entered the elevator, they were there. Always in the corner, always quiet, never acknowledging anyone else. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but after a while, I began to notice something unsettling. The person seemed to always be there, in that same spot, whether I was leaving or arriving. It was as if they were waiting for me. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, there are plenty of people who work in the same building. But it wasn't just their presence that started to unsettle me. There was something about them, something I couldn't quite place. They had an aura of stillness about them, a complete absence of emotion. No smile, no frown, just a blank stare. Their clothes were always the same: a simple, dark jacket, worn shoes, and a hat that hid their face most of the time. The strangest part, I never saw them get out of the elevator. Whenever the doors opened, no matter the floor, they stayed put. I tried not to let my mind race, but over time, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As the days went by, I began to notice little things. The elevator would stop at random floors when no one had pressed the button. Sometimes, the lights would flicker just for a second, and in that moment, I could feel the temperature drop, as though the elevator was moving in a place where time didn't exist. But none of this really bothered me, at least not at first. The elevator was an old building, after all. Faulty lights, strange stops, and creepy people were just part of the package. Or so I told myself. And yet, the longer I rode that elevator, the more I began to feel as though it was watching me. That person, standing so still in the corner, was like a silent observer to my every move. And in their silence, I felt my own unease grow. I never spoke to them. I never tried to acknowledge them. I didn't want to seem like I was the one who was strange. But as time went on, I started avoiding the elevator altogether. I'd take the stairs if I could, or I'd wait for a coworker to join me. But no matter how hard I tried, that person seemed to show up at the same time every day, without fail. One evening, as I stepped into the elevator to head home, I felt the familiar sense of dread creeping up my spine. There they were, in the same spot, silent as ever. But something was different this time. Their eyes, those cold, dark eyes, were no longer fixed on the elevator doors. This time, they were staring right at me. I froze. It was only for a second, but it felt like an eternity. The elevator doors closed, and the silence in the small, confined space was deafening. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when the elevator reached my floor, I stepped out quickly, not even looking back. It wasn't until I got home that night that the true weight of the situation started to hit me. The person. Who were they? Why did they always show up when I was there? What did they want? And why had they been staring at me? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And as the days passed, I began to question everything. That elevator, that person, nothing made sense anymore. But I had no idea that this was just the beginning of something far worse. It wasn't until a particularly grim Tuesday that the first real sign hit me, something subtle but unmistakable. It was mid-afternoon, and I was wrapping up some paperwork in my office when I realized I had forgotten to grab lunch. I quickly glanced at the clock, 4 o'clock. It had been a long day of endless phone calls and drafting contracts, and I felt the weight of exhaustion start to creep in. I decided to take a quick break and grab a bite from the deli down the street. The elevator ride, as always, was a quick moment of solitude in my otherwise chaotic day. I could feel the familiar hum of the building's old structure as I pressed the button for the ground floor. When the doors opened, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor, expecting the usual calm ride. But something felt different this time. The air was heavier, colder. It was subtle, just a slight shift, but enough to make me pause for a second. I glanced at the corner. There they were again. The person, still and silent as usual, but this time their gaze was even more intense. It wasn't just that they were looking at me, it was as if they were waiting for something I couldn't grasp. I felt a chill run through me. The elevator felt smaller, as though the space between the walls was closing in on me. The usual hum of the elevator was replaced by an eerie silence, and the lights above flickered for a brief moment, causing me to glance up. I told myself it was just a power surge or a glitch in the system, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the doors began to close, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a reflection of myself in the mirrored wall of the elevator. It was a fleeting image, but for a second, it seemed to shift unnaturally, like a shadow moved across it. I blinked hard, but when I looked again, it was gone. I tried to push it out of my mind, blaming it on the tiredness setting in. I pulled my coat tighter around me and turned my attention back to the doors. The ride was uneventful, no more flickers, no strange occurrences until I reached the ground floor. When the elevator doors opened, the person didn't move. They just stood there, staring at the ground. I stepped out and quickly walked toward the exit, feeling the weight of their gaze on my back as I walked away. The unsettling sensation lingered in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't figure out why, but the incident felt wrong. It was the way the person had looked at me waiting, and the way the elevator had felt smaller, tighter. I knew I couldn't brush it off as just another strange day in the office. I felt like I was missing something important, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the memory of that strange ride stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was it about that person, that feeling of being watched? I found myself becoming more and more cautious whenever I entered the elevator. I began to notice things that had once seemed normal. The strange humming sound the elevator made, the way it sometimes shuddered as it moved between floors, the strange way it would occasionally stop unexpectedly just for a second and then start moving again. It was the oddest things that started to bother me. At first, it was just a feeling, a sense that I was being observed, but soon it became harder to ignore. I started avoiding the elevator altogether when I could. I'd take the stairs if I could help it, but that was difficult given the long hours I worked. And on those days when I couldn't avoid the elevator, I found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that person standing in the corner again. It wasn't until one evening that things began to escalate. I had stayed late at the office to finish some work. The building had grown eerily quiet, and I was the only one left on my floor. I had just finished gathering my things when I headed for the elevator to leave. It was a little past 9 o'clock, and I was exhausted physically and mentally. As I approached the elevator, I noticed the doors were already open. It was strange because I hadn't pressed the button, and I hadn't seen anyone else in the hallway. I stood there for a moment, unsure of whether to step inside. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, but I shook it off. It was late. I was tired. I pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator began its descent, but almost immediately I felt something was off. The air inside felt colder again, heavier, like it had been before. I glanced toward the corner, and there, once again, was the person, silent, unmoving, watching. But this time, there was something more. The strange sensation of being trapped, of being watched, intensified. I glanced at the buttons on the wall. The elevator hadn't stopped at any other floors, but the lights above flickered again, more violently this time. And then, for a split second, the elevator came to a complete halt. The quiet was suffocating, and I could feel my heart beating faster in my chest. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. I looked at the floor numbers, still no change. I pressed the emergency button, but nothing happened. It was in that moment, as I stood there, waiting for the elevator to start moving again, that I felt a cold, strange sensation creep up my spine. It was like a presence, a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I turned to the person, my eyes locked on them, but they remained unmoved, just standing there in silence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead, and my mouth was dry. What was happening? Why was the elevator not moving? And why did it feel like I wasn't alone in that tiny space? I reached for the emergency button again, but this time, just before my finger touched it, the elevator jolted and began moving again, as if nothing had happened. The floor numbers started lighting up again, and within a few seconds, we had reached the ground floor. The doors opened, and I stepped out without a word, barely able to keep myself together. I felt like I had narrowly escaped something terrible. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the person following me out of the elevator. But no one was there. The hallway was empty, just like it had been when I had arrived. That night, I couldn't sleep. The events of the evening kept playing over and over in my head. What had happened in that elevator? What had caused it to stop? And why did it feel like I was being watched by that person? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't just imagining things. Something strange was happening, something that went beyond the usual quirks of an old building. And I had a feeling that I hadn't seen the last of it. The next few days seemed ordinary on the surface. I went to work as usual, took the same elevator, dealt with the same mundane tasks. But underneath it all, something had changed. I could feel it in the air. The building felt off, heavier somehow, like it was holding its breath. It wasn't until later in the week that the strange occurrences began to intensify. It started small, almost imperceptible at first. I noticed that the elevator doors were open when I arrived, even though no one had pressed the button. It happened once, then twice. Each time, I'd look around the empty hallway, wondering if someone had been there before me, but there was no one in sight. I'd shrug it off, press the button for my floor, and continue with my day. But it didn't stop there. One morning, as I entered the elevator, I noticed the floor numbers flickering. They weren't just blinking, they were glitching, almost as if someone was tampering with the system. My reflection in the mirror on the elevator wall caught my attention, and I froze. For just a brief moment, my face shifted, distorting like a ripple in the air. I blinked, trying to shake off the strange sensation, but the reflection quickly returned to normal. I didn't know whether to attribute it to exhaustion or something more sinister, but I couldn't ignore the growing unease in my chest. The eerie sensation followed me through the days. Every time I stepped into the elevator, it felt like something was different. The air grew colder, the lights flickered more often, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I couldn't stop thinking about the person. Every time I rode the elevator, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting them to be there, watching. But every time, the corner was empty. It wasn't until late that week that I began to notice something truly disturbing. I had stayed later than usual, finishing up some paperwork in my office when I heard the faintest sound. It wasn't a voice, but a hum, a soft, low vibration. At first, I thought it was the usual sound of the building's air conditioning, but when I listened closer, I realized it was coming from the elevator shaft. I got up and went to the door, my hand resting on the cold metal handle. The hum grew louder, almost as if the elevator itself was alive, moving, even though I knew no one had called it. I stood there for a few moments, listening to the unsettling noise. There was something off about it, something that didn't belong in the otherwise quiet building. My heart began to race, and I turned back to my desk, forcing myself to focus on the work in front of me. But the hum continued, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Later that evening, as I made my way to the elevator, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The hallway seemed darker than usual, the lights overhead flickering in a strange rhythm. The elevator doors were wide open, as if waiting for me to step inside. I hesitated. My fingers twitched toward the button, but I hesitated. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure! It was standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the dim light. It wasn't clear enough for me to make out any details, but I could feel its presence. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was nothing more than a trick of the light. But then, without warning, the elevator's lights flickered, and I heard it the same low hum, louder than before, vibrating through the walls. I stepped into the elevator, the hairs on my neck standing on end. My breath came out in short bursts as I pressed the button for my floor. The doors slid closed, and I felt the familiar shudder of the elevator as it began to ascend. But something was wrong. The air inside felt colder again, like I was trapped in a steel coffin, and the hum continued, growing louder, more intense. The elevator stopped. It was subtle at first, just a brief pause. But when the seconds stretched into minutes, I began to panic. I pressed the emergency button, but there was no response. The floor numbers didn't change, and the elevator remained motionless. It was as if the building itself had swallowed me whole. I was alone in the dark, suffocating under the weight of silence. And then I heard a soft, almost inaudible noise, a shuffle of feet, followed by a quiet breath. I turned toward the corner of the elevator, where the shadowy figure had stood just moments before. But there was nothing there. I don't know how long I stood there. Time seemed to stretch in all directions, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out, but the elevator refused to move. I pressed the emergency button again, but it remained unresponsive. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The silence was deafening. And then, without any warning, the elevator lurched into motion, jerking me backward as it began to descend. The sudden movement sent my heart into overdrive, and I stumbled, gripping the railing for support. The floor numbers blinked erratically, and the elevator began to shake, as if it was being pulled in two different directions. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't dare look back. The building felt colder now, and I had an overwhelming sense that something was wrong. Something was watching me. The hallway was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just my imagination. I tried to brush it off as just another glitch in the building's aging infrastructure. But deep down, I knew something more was at play. Something darker. And when I arrived home that night, I couldn't escape the sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. The strange events were becoming more frequent now. The hum, the flickering lights, the oppressive silence. It was as if the building had become a living, breathing thing, and it was beginning to consume me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was time to investigate. The next morning, I returned to the office with a determination I hadn't felt in days. I needed answers. I couldn't keep pretending that this was just a series of strange coincidences. I had to find out what was happening, and more importantly, why. I went straight to the elevator control room. It was a small, dimly lit space located just off the main hallway. The door was unlocked, which I found odd, but I didn't hesitate. I entered the room and immediately began inspecting the control panels. Everything seemed in order, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. A piece of paper tucked into the corner of the desk. It wasn't there the day before, and it definitely wasn't something I'd left behind. My heart began to race as I walked over and picked it up. The handwriting was uneven, as if written in haste, and the message was brief. Do not ride the elevator. It watches. The words sent a chill through me, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop. My mind raced. Who had left this note? And more importantly, what did it mean? The atmosphere inside the building had become suffocating. I felt it with every step I took, an invisible pressure pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. The unsettling presence I'd been feeling over the last few days had grown stronger, more pronounced. It was as though something was actively watching me now. It wasn't just a sensation anymore. It was a constant, palpable force in the air. It didn't matter whether it was day or night. The building felt alive, breathing in rhythm with my own racing heart. I had told myself I'd be prepared, but no amount of mental preparation could have braced me for what came next. After finding the strange note in the elevator control room, I'd gone home that night with a growing sense of dread gnawing at me. I barely slept, my mind endlessly racing, replaying the strange events, the glitches, the flickers, the hum that seemed to pulse from deep within the building. But that night, I decided that I had to face whatever was lurking. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't scared. My curiosity was stronger than my fear now. I had to know what was going on. The next morning, as the building hummed with its usual activity, I felt an odd sense of calm. I was prepared, or so I convinced myself. I made my way to the elevator, my mind locked in on the goal of finding answers, no matter the cost. I walked toward the doors, which slid open in front of me as though they'd been waiting. The silence was unnerving. The hum was there again, but it wasn't the same this time. It wasn't soft. It wasn't distant. It was close, so close that I could feel the vibrations in my chest as I stood inside. The doors closed behind me with a sound that felt too final, like a trap. My finger hovered over the button, but I hesitated. And then, without warning, the elevator began to descend faster than it should have, its familiar, rhythmic motion turning into something erratic. I grabbed the railing to steady myself as the numbers on the floor panel flickered and buzzed. The air inside grew colder with each passing second, and the lights above me began to flicker wildly, casting the space into a strobe-like effect. I could feel the pressure rising in my chest, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I glanced toward the corner of the elevator. My reflection wasn't the only thing I saw. There was someone there, something there. It was as if it had materialized out of the shadows, standing just behind me. I turned my head quickly, but the figure was gone. I blinked, my pulse racing, my breath catching in my throat. My hand moved shakily to the emergency button, but before I could press it, the elevator screeched to a halt. The sudden stop was enough to throw me off balance, and I stumbled forward, barely catching myself before I fell. The doors didn't open. There was no sound, no movement, only silence. Then I heard it. A soft scrape, like something dragging across metal. It started faint, almost too quiet to hear, but then it grew louder. And then, a voice, soft, faint, like a whisper from the other side of the world. Leave! I froze. Leave! It wasn't just the words that sent a shiver down my spine, it was the tone. It wasn't human. The voice was hollow, distorted, and unnatural. I pressed my back against the elevator wall, my hand gripping the railing so tightly that my knuckles ached. The voice repeated, this time louder, more insistent. Leave, now. I swallowed, my throat dry, the fear in my chest almost suffocating. The air felt thicker, like it was pushing against me, holding me in place. My hands trembled as I reached for the button again, but before I could press it, the voice spoke again. You should have listened. That's when the lights went out completely. The pitch-black darkness surrounded me, smothering all sense of direction. I couldn't hear the hum anymore. I couldn't hear anything. The air was heavy, damp, cloying. I couldn't breathe. I gasped, trying to find the button to open the doors, but my fingers felt numb, slipping off the panel. Then, the elevator moved again, this time, upward. It didn't stop. The elevator shot upward with an unnatural speed, the sound of the gears grinding against the walls filling the space. My stomach lurched as I was thrown against the back wall, and I held on for dear life, my fingers white with tension. The floors clicked by, but the numbers didn't change. They flickered, then disappeared altogether. I glanced around, but there was no light, no way to see what was happening. A sudden, sharp pain shot through my chest, like something invisible had gripped my heart. I gasped, clutching at my chest, but the pain only intensified. And then, the sensation changed, no longer physical, but emotional. It was as if I was drowning in a sea of panic, fear, an overwhelming sense of doom that I couldn't escape, couldn't push away. My breath came in shallow gasps, my vision blurred, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. And then, the elevator stopped. Dead silence. I barely had time to process what was happening before I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. They were coming from behind me. Someone was in the elevator with me. I turned, expecting to see nothing, but there it was her. She was standing there, just beyond the faintest shadow, her face obscured by the darkness. Her figure was tall, almost unnatural, stretched out in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The skin was pale, sickly, with black veins running beneath it. Her eyes were wide, hollow, empty. She didn't move, she didn't blink, she didn't speak, but somehow I could feel her watching me. Her gaze felt like it was burning into me, like her eyes were digging through my very soul. And then, slowly, impossibly, she began to move. It was a slow crawl at first, her limbs jerking unnaturally as she dragged herself toward me. Her fingers scraped against the floor, and with each movement, the sound of her bones grinding against the walls filled the space with an otherworldly noise. I stumbled back, my heart thundering in my chest, the panic rising in me like a tidal wave. The elevator seemed to stretch, the walls closing in around me, growing tighter and tighter until I could no longer breathe. The pressure was suffocating, unbearable. I was trapped. There was no escape. She reached out. Her cold, bony fingers grazed my arm, and a surge of ice-cold dread flooded through my body. The touch burned with an unholy chill, and I screamed, finally breaking free of the paralysis that had held me. I scrambled toward the corner of the elevator, my legs weak, my mind reeling. But it was too late. She was too close. The doors didn't open. The elevator refused to move. And then, in that moment of pure, unfiltered terror, the world around me seemed to warp. The shadows deepened, swallowing everything whole. The walls of the elevator pulsed, breathing in and out like some giant, living creature. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the twisted, hollow face of the thing that had been waiting for me. The thing that had been watching me from the very start. And then, nothing. The elevator was still. The lights flickered back to life, illuminating the empty space. The numbers on the panel were no longer flickering in confusion, and the oppressive pressure I had felt earlier, the one that made it feel like the walls were closing in, seemed to have faded. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe it was just a nightmare. Maybe I had imagined the entire thing. But then I glanced at the reflection in the elevator mirror. There it was again. The same face, the same hollow eyes, the same twisted, bony figure standing just behind me. My pulse surged in my throat. I froze, my breath catching in my chest as I turned around. Nothing. The elevator was empty. The space was entirely still, silent, and as real as anything I had ever known. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't rationalize it. My hands shook as I fumbled for the emergency button, slamming it desperately. I needed to get out. I needed to escape, even if I had no idea what I was running from. The elevator doors opened with a slow groan, revealing the dimly lit corridor beyond. I stepped out, still reeling from the overwhelming fear that gripped me. The world outside felt different, distorted. The walls were familiar, yet they seemed wrong. The hallway stretched farther than it should have, as though the building itself was somehow expanding beyond its normal dimensions. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but the feeling of wrongness didn't go away. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't deal with whatever it was that had followed me, that thing that had been in the elevator with me. I couldn't stay another second. I bolted down the hallway, ignoring the strange noises that echoed off the walls. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, seemed to follow me, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing. The elevator had already gone back to its normal position, but the echoes of its sinister hum filled my ears. The front door was my only escape. My fingers, trembling, fumbled with the keycard, swiping it over and over again in a frantic, feverish attempt to open it. But it wouldn't budge. The lock was jammed. Panic began to grip me again as I turned back toward the elevator, hoping against hope that it would still be functional, that I could escape this nightmare before it consumed me completely. I ran back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and pressed the call button over and over again, pleading for the elevator to come down, to take me far away from this place. When the elevator doors finally opened, the moment felt surreal. I stepped inside without thinking, my mind still reeling, desperate for the escape it promised. As soon as I entered, the doors slid shut behind me. But this time, there was no strange force pulling me, no terrifying voice whispering from the darkness. There was no figure standing behind me, waiting. The elevator hummed softly, its familiar, rhythmic motion reassuring me. It seemed like it was just another ordinary elevator ride. No screaming lights, no suffocating darkness, no distorted figures or strange whispers. It felt almost like I had imagined the whole thing. And yet, deep down, I knew I hadn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was watching me, that whatever had happened in that elevator hadn't been some twisted hallucination, it had been real. I pressed the button for the ground floor and waited. When the doors opened once again, I stepped out into the lobby, expecting to feel the weight of the atmosphere lifted, ready to step out into the fresh air, free from whatever nightmare had haunted me. But something was off. The lobby was too still, too quiet. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnervingly as I walked toward the exit, but the doors wouldn't open. I swiped my card again. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. I could feel the walls closing in, the temperature dropping with each second that passed. The air felt thin, like I couldn't get enough of it. My body trembled, my hands shaking as I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. This wasn't normal. I was trapped. Suddenly, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. The floor beneath me was different. There was a faint marking in the corner of the room. It was the same mark I had seen in the elevator control room. The same twisted, jagged line, almost like a symbol, carved into the floor. I moved toward it, almost against my will, my legs moving as if some force were guiding me. I bent down, reaching out to touch the mark. The moment my fingers made contact with it, the building seemed to come alive. The lights above me flickered again. The hum, soft at first, grew louder, deeper, and the temperature dropped further. I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere deep inside the building. I wasn't alone. The elevator doors opened once more. But this time, I didn't have the strength to move. My legs wouldn't carry me anymore, and my body was numb. I stood frozen as I watched the figure step out of the elevator, walking toward me, its eyes hollow and dark. I should have run. I should have escaped. But I didn't. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its face twisted into something inhuman. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, crooked teeth that seemed to stretch on forever. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." Its voice was like the sound of dry leaves rustling in the wind, sharp, hollow, dead. I couldn't respond. I couldn't even scream. When I woke up again, I was lying on the cold, tiled floor, the walls of the lobby still around me. But everything had changed. The building was no longer the place I had once known. It was twisted, distorted, an echo of what it had been. The elevator, the hallways, everything felt alien. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had crossed a line, a threshold, and there was no going back. I had fled before, but I had returned. I had escaped before, but the thing that had followed me had never left. It was still there, lurking, waiting. The elevator had never really taken me anywhere. It had only led me deeper into a nightmare that would never end. And there was no way out. The building stands, unchanged from the outside, but I know better now. There are no answers, no resolutions, only questions that will never be answered. And so, I walk away from it all, leaving the haunted halls behind, but never truly free. The elevator still calls to me, even from a distance. It's waiting. It's always waiting. The story doesn't end here. Not for me. Not for anyone who stepped inside that cursed building. Because the elevator is always there, watching, waiting. And sooner or later, someone else will make the mistake of stepping inside. As I walk away from the building, the weight of what I've endured weighs heavily on my shoulders, every step taking me farther from the nightmare, but somehow closer to the realization that I'm never truly free. The air feels different now, colder in a way that goes beyond the temperature, like the world itself knows that I've crossed a line and there's no returning from it. I know it sounds absurd. I know it sounds like something out of a horror film, a twisted story designed to entertain, to make you question the reality of your own existence. But I can tell you with absolute certainty, this was no dream, no hallucination. The things I experienced, what I saw, what I heard, what I felt are all too real. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see that same twisted face. I hear the echoes of those footsteps, the unmistakable click of the elevator doors. And it's always there. I want to forget. I want to go back to my life before it all happened. I want to return to the simple, mundane days when everything felt safe and predictable. But how do you unsee something like that? How do you forget something that has embedded itself in your mind like a scar that refuses to heal? The memories are etched into my very being, and no matter where I go, they follow me. The figure in the elevator, the empty space that stretched impossibly long, the sensation of being watched, even when no one was there. The unsettling feeling that something isn't quite right, that something has shifted. The building is still there, but it's not the same anymore. The elevator is still there, but it's not the same. It has changed, and so have I. As the days pass, I begin to realize something. Maybe this was never about the elevator at all. Maybe it was about me, about what I was willing to face or refuse to face. I was so caught up in escaping, in running away from whatever was waiting for me, that I forgot to look inward. The truth is, there are things in life we cannot escape. There are moments that change us, that mark us, that leave an indelible imprint on our souls. The elevator, the dark figure, the strange occurrences, it wasn't just a haunting of a place. It was a reflection of something deeper within me, something I had buried, something I had avoided. Maybe it was fear itself. Maybe it was my own doubts, my own insecurities. Maybe it was a warning. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night. Some things are meant to remain a mystery, buried beneath the surface, never fully revealed. But I know one thing for certain. The world is far more complicated than we realize. There are forces at play in this life that we can't always see or explain. Some things we can't outrun, no matter how fast we try to move. I've learned to live with the echoes of the past. Every now and then, when I step into an elevator, I can't help but feel the rush of fear crawling up my spine. I wonder if the same thing that happened to me could happen again. I wonder if that twisted, hollow figure is still out there, waiting for its next victim. The realization that we are never truly free. The memories linger, the fear remains, and the elevator waits. Maybe one day, someone else will step inside, and the cycle will begin again. But for now, I walk away, haunted by the echoes of the past, the strange pull of the elevator, and the chilling truth that sometimes there is no escape. This happened a few years ago, and to this day, I still can't shake the feeling that something isn't quite right. Let me take you back to the beginning. It was a crisp fall weekend, and I was ready for a much-needed break. Life had been stressful lately, and I figured a weekend getaway in a small, quiet hotel would be the perfect way to recharge. I had heard about this hotel from a friend who had stayed there a while back. He mentioned it was a cozy, old-fashioned place, tucked away in the woods, a real escape from the everyday hustle. The hotel was located in a small town, not far from the city, but just isolated enough to make you feel like you were in a completely different world. The kind of place where you could go to disconnect, no traffic, no loud neighbors, just peace and quiet. I checked into the hotel alone. I had no particular reason for being by myself, but after the past few months, I craved some solitude. The receptionist, a woman in her early 60s, greeted me with a warm smile and handed me a brass key. "Room 213, she said, her voice surprisingly gentle for someone who had probably seen their fair share of guests. I thanked her, took the key, and headed to my room. The hotel's interior was charming in a way that felt frozen in time. The wooden floors creaked under my feet, and the old-fashioned chandeliers hung low above me, their crystals sparkling just enough to give the place a soft, eerie glow. I passed by rooms that each had doors with brass nameplates, worn with age but still legible, as if they were trying to hold on to their past. As I entered room 213, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't bad, but it was distinct, a mixture of dust, old books, and something else I couldn't quite place. The room itself wasn't large, but it had everything I needed. A bed with a comforter that looked like it had been there for decades, a nightstand with an old-fashioned lamp, and a window that overlooked a dense stretch of trees. The walls were covered in faded floral wallpaper, and the carpet felt thick beneath my feet, almost as if it hadn't been replaced in years. I put down my bag, threw my coat over the chair, and took a moment to soak in the peacefulness of the place. The hum of the distant air conditioner was the only sound. There was something oddly calming about the hotel's stillness, and I could feel the weight of my day-to-day stress begin to lift. The evening went by uneventfully. I had a simple dinner in the hotel's restaurant pasta. Nothing special, but it was satisfying. The kind of meal you don't really remember later, but at the time, it feels like exactly what you needed. Afterward, I retreated back to my room to relax. I settled in with a book, the soft light from the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. For a while, I let myself get lost in the pages, the worries of the outside world forgotten. But then, something strange happened. At first, I didn't think much of it. A soft thud came from the hallway, faint but distinct. The kind of noise that you'd brush off if you weren't paying attention. It could have been someone upstairs, or maybe the wind rattling something loose. But then, a second thud, this one louder, followed by a dragging sound. It was brief, almost like someone was walking with heavy footsteps, their feet scraping against the floor. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the noise faded into silence. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on the age of the building, or maybe just the sound of my own imagination running wild. But as the night wore on, the sounds continued, each one more pronounced than the last. The occasional thud, followed by the eerie dragging noise, echoed through the walls. I wasn't sure what it was, but it was unsettling. There I was, sitting alone in that room, trying to convince myself it was just the creaks and groans of an old building. But then came the most unnerving sound of all. The door handle rattled. At first, I thought it was the wind or some kind of odd draft, but the longer I listened, the more I realized it was something deliberate. The handle was being shaken, almost as if someone or something was trying to get in. I stood there frozen, staring at the door, heart pounding. Who could be out there? The hotel had felt so empty when I checked in. I hadn't seen anyone except the receptionist. Slowly, I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. But before I could touch it, the rattling stopped, and the hallway fell completely silent. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just a coincidence or maybe even a joke played by a fellow guest. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The night went on, but I couldn't bring myself to relax. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, half expecting it to open at any moment. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I managed to drift into an uneasy sleep. But the noises, the rattling door, and the feeling of being watched never truly left my mind. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling unrested despite having spent the night in a seemingly peaceful room. The odd noises from the previous night lingered in my mind, but I chalked it up to being too focused on the unfamiliar surroundings. I'd been traveling a lot recently, and the idea of being in a new place had probably made me more sensitive to every creak, every sigh of the old building. I shook it off, telling myself to relax. After all, it was just a strange old hotel, and the noises were nothing more than the quirks of a building that had seen decades of history. I decided to take a walk around the hotel grounds to clear my head. Stepping out of room 213, I was greeted by the quiet of the hallway, unusually silent, I thought, considering it was still early in the morning. The wooden floors groaned under my feet as I walked down the hall, but there were no other signs of life. No footsteps, no doors opening, no voices, just the faint sound of the wind blowing through the cracks in the walls. I grabbed a cup of coffee from the lobby and sat down in one of the lounge chairs by a large, dusty window that looked out onto the parking lot. The hotel's small garden-like courtyard was visible as well, with trees that seemed to stretch far into the distance. I tried to enjoy the moment, but there was an odd heaviness to the air. The sense of stillness around me felt suffocating, like the hotel was holding its breath. As I sat there, I couldn't help but notice that the coffee in my cup had started to shift ever so slightly, but enough to catch my attention. The liquid seemed to ripple, moving in small waves without any explanation. I blinked and stared, unsure if I was seeing things. Maybe it was just my tiredness getting the best of me, but there it was. I watched as the surface of the coffee danced, faint ripples traveling outward, as though someone had lightly tapped the cup from underneath. But there was no one around. I hesitated before lifting the cup, holding it in my hand and turning it slowly. Nothing seemed wrong with the cup, and the coffee was still warm. Nothing unusual there. The ripples had stopped, but my heart rate quickened, and I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The rest of the morning was spent in relative normalcy. I explored the hotel a bit more, wandering through its halls, trying to get a sense of the place. It was one of those buildings that seemed to have its own history, old pictures on the walls, an antique clock on the mantelpiece, a faint musty smell that clung to the corners. I found the dining room, where a few scattered guests were having breakfast, the sound of clinking silverware filling the air. The food wasn't anything to write home about, but it was warm and filling. Still, I couldn't escape the sense that something about this place was off. Later that afternoon, I decided to venture into the woods behind the hotel. There was a small trail that snaked through the trees, leading deeper into the dense forest. I thought a walk might help clear my head and give me a break from the strange feeling that had settled over me. I had been on many hikes before, but something about this forest was different. It felt heavy. The trees towered over me, their branches stretching like skeletal arms, blocking out the sun and casting long shadows on the ground. As I walked along the trail, the sounds of the outside world seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to swallow everything around me. There were no birds singing, no rustling of leaves. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The only sound was the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots, and even that seemed muffled by the thick underbrush. It was then that I noticed something odd, a small, weathered sign standing by the side of the trail. It was barely visible, almost as if it had been hidden on purpose. The paint had faded, and the words were illegible, but there was something unsettling about it. It didn't belong there, not in the middle of this quiet forest. I paused, staring at it for a moment, before continuing along the path. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but by the time I made my way back to the hotel, I felt more uneasy than when I had left. Something about that sign had unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. That night, I returned to my room. The hotel felt colder now, and the air had a strange heaviness to it, like something was pressing down on the entire building. I felt an odd sense of dread wash over me, but I convinced myself it was just the exhaustion catching up with me. I decided to call it an early night, figuring that sleep would help settle my nerves. And then, just as I began to drift off, I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, but this time they were closer. They echoed outside my door, and I could hear them clearly, as if someone was standing just on the other side. I held my breath, waiting for the footsteps to pass, but they didn't. The sound stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then came the softest knock on the door, barely audible, but unmistakable. I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, staring at the door, my entire body frozen in place. Who was out there? And why didn't I hear anyone walking away? I wanted to call out, to demand who it was, but my voice caught in my throat. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, before the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I finally gathered the courage to get up. My legs were shaking as I approached the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the handle. I opened it slowly, heart racing, only to find nothing. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I could still hear the faint echo of footsteps, but they seemed to come from far away now. I stepped back inside my room, locking the door behind me. What was happening in this hotel? I couldn't explain it, but the feeling that something was wrong, something very wrong, was stronger than ever. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences, each one more unsettling than the last. It was as though the hotel had shifted into a different reality, one where the rules of normalcy no longer applied. The air seemed thicker, the silence more profound, and every creak of the building felt like a whisper from another time. It began small, as if the hotel was testing me, gauging my response. In the mornings, I'd find things moved slightly out of place, an empty glass that had shifted a few inches, a book on the nightstand that wasn't where I'd left it. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe I was just forgetting where I'd placed things, or that housekeeping had been in and I hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. There was something off about this place. One evening, I sat in the small lobby, nursing a cup of coffee. The dim lighting and the musty scent of old wood made it feel like I was sitting in the past, disconnected from the present. I watched as the few guests in the lobby passed through, their footsteps echoing eerily against the stone floors. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes, gave me a faint smile as she processed the checkout of another guest. But there was an air of tension in the room, as if no one really wanted to stay too long. I didn't have much of a plan, but I found myself walking down the same hallways I'd explored the day before, a sense of unease creeping over me. As I turned a corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door to room 214 was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see inside. But it wasn't the door itself that caused me to stop dead in my tracks. It was the shadows. The light coming from the hallway cast strange shapes inside the room. Figures seemed to move within the shadows, flitting from one corner to the next, but I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or something more sinister. My heart thudded loudly in my chest as I approached the door, almost against my will. I should have walked away, should have ignored the bizarre sight, but something pulled me closer. I reached out and pushed the door open, only to find the room empty. The bed was perfectly made, the curtains swayed gently in the breeze, and the silence was so thick it felt like the air itself was pressing in on me. A strange sense of disappointment washed over me. Why had I even expected to find something? I turned to leave, but as I did, something caught my eye. On the floor by the bed was a small piece of paper, crumpled but not torn. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers brushing against the rough edges of the paper. It was a receipt of sorts, printed in a language I didn't recognize, with a date that was weeks earlier. The only word in English was check out. I shoved the paper into my pocket, my mind racing with questions. What was going on here? Why had this receipt been left behind in a room that clearly hadn't been touched? And why did it feel like I was being watched? The next day, the tension in the hotel was palpable. The once quiet halls were now filled with strange sounds, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, faint taps that echoed in the dead of night. I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from, but I knew they weren't just the building settling. In my search for answers, I went to the front desk and asked the receptionist about the history of the hotel. She gave me a blank stare for a moment, almost as though she hadn't heard me, before responding in a low voice. "It's old," she said, her eyes darting nervously around the lobby. "Been around for a long time. Some guests, they say it's haunted." The words hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of them settle over me. Haunted? Was that really what this was? "People come and go," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some stay for a night, some for longer, but not many come back." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Not many come back," I repeated, trying to mask the growing panic in my voice. She looked away, as though embarrassed to speak further, and then quickly excused herself, leaving me standing there in stunned silence. Later that evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I returned to the area where I'd found the crumpled receipt earlier and began inspecting the floor more closely. The more I looked, the more I realized how strange the room felt cold, despite the warmth from the radiator, and distant, as if it didn't belong to this world at all. I ran my hand over the walls, searching for any clues, any reason why I felt such a strong pull toward this room. That's when I noticed the door that hadn't been opened before. It was now wide open, as though someone had entered and left without a sound. The room was empty, just as it had been before, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something was different. I stepped inside, my senses on high alert. The air was still, but the room itself felt alive. There was an energy to it, an electric hum that made my skin prickle. I walked slowly toward the bed and noticed something I hadn't seen before. A photo. It was a black and white picture, old and faded, of what seemed like the hotel staff from decades ago. The people in the photo were standing in front of the hotel, smiling awkwardly for the camera. But there was one thing that stood out, one person who looked completely out of place. A man standing off to the side, his face partially obscured by shadows, but his eyes were the only thing visible, and they were staring directly at me. I dropped the photo in shock, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never seen this person before, but somehow I felt like I had. It was as though the man was looking right into me, into my very soul, and I couldn't escape his gaze. I grabbed the photo off the floor and left the room, my hands shaking. The hallway felt longer now, more oppressive, and as I walked back to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something not quite human. The air was thick with the sensation of being watched, and I couldn't escape it. Back in my room, I looked at the photo again, my eyes scanning the faces of the hotel staff, but no one else stood out. Just the man, staring at me from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, even now, from somewhere beyond the photo, beyond the hotel walls. That night, I didn't sleep. The room was too quiet, too still, and I couldn't get rid of the sensation that the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. That night, the hotel felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The walls seemed to breathe, the floorboards groaned with every step I took, and the very air around me buzzed with a strange, almost electrical charge. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even sit still. It was as though something was pulling at me, something far deeper than mere curiosity or fear. I had to know what was happening in this place, what was lurking in the shadows, what it was that had slowly been eroding my peace of mind since the moment I checked in. It had been days since I found the photo. The man's face haunted me, his eyes so alive with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't get over the feeling that he was not just looking at me through that faded image, but watching me, tracking my every movement, as if we were connected in a way I couldn't fully understand. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, his face, his eyes, his shadow. By now, I had spent every free moment in the hotel trying to find more answers. I asked the receptionist again, but her responses grew more erratic, and she became visibly more uncomfortable with each passing question. She would glance around nervously, as though afraid someone might be listening, before telling me as little as possible. On the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront whatever this was head on. It was the only way I would ever get any peace. I had to face the man in the photo. I had to face whatever was haunting the hotel. I packed a small bag and decided to explore one last part of the hotel, an area I hadn't ventured into yet. It was on the top floor, an attic space that hadn't been in use for years. The hallways were dark, barely illuminated by flickering bulbs that seemed to have their own agenda. The place felt ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades, and it smelled of mildew and dust. The air here was even heavier than it had been in the rest of the building, as though it carried the weight of forgotten memories. I stood before the door to the attic, staring at the worn handle. For a moment, I thought about turning back. I thought about the long hours of sleep I'd missed and the days I'd spent searching for answers, each one leading to a more tangled mess. But it was too late now. The fear had already set in, and it was too strong to ignore. I turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was dim, bathed in a soft, sickly light that filtered through the dirty windows. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old trunks, cobwebs, and forgotten things, objects that felt out of place, out of time. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something in the far corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just another pile of old furniture, another relic of the hotel's long history. But then, it moved. My heart raced, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. But there it was, a dark shape, shifting in the corner, as if it were waiting for me, waiting to show me what I had been looking for all along. I didn't take a step forward. Instead, I stood there frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. And then, the shape turned slowly, deliberately, and for the first time, I saw the full form. It was a man standing there, his features obscured by shadows, but his eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. They were the same eyes from the photo, the same eyes that had been following me since I first entered the hotel. He wasn't just a reflection in a picture anymore. He was standing right in front of me. The room seemed to close in around me. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I tried to speak, but no words came out. It was as if my body refused to cooperate, as if the man before me was holding me in place with his gaze alone. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice low and raspy, like it had been trapped in this room for years. I froze. His words felt like a warning, but there was no way to ignore them. I had to know more. I needed to understand what was happening. "Who are you?" I finally managed to croak, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step forward, and with each step, the air grew colder. It felt as if the temperature in the room had dropped by several degrees in a matter of seconds. "I am what you've been looking for," he said, his voice growing more intense, more desperate. "I am the reason you couldn't leave, the reason no one leaves." A flood of panic washed over me. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this man, this thing, as I possibly could. But my legs were rooted to the floor. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. "You're trapped," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, but it still reverberated in my mind. "All of you are. The ones who stay too long. The ones who dig too deep. We're all connected now. There's no way out. No way to escape." My breath quickened, my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't process what he was saying. The fear, the shock, it was all too much. My mind raced, trying to find any logical explanation, any reason for what was happening. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that there was no explanation. There was no reason. This was beyond anything I could understand. The man took another step forward, and I could feel his presence closing in on me. His eyes burned into mine, and I could feel them pulling at my very soul, dragging me into the darkness that surrounded him. "You've seen too much," he whispered, his voice like a breath against my ear. "And now you're one of us." And just like that, everything went dark. The cold, suffocating air had lifted. The weight that pressed on my chest was gone, but the terror remained. I was lying on the bed in my hotel room, my body stiff, my mind a complete fog. I couldn't remember how I got back here. How had I escaped the man in the attic? How had I gotten away from that cold, bone-chilling darkness? I sat up slowly, my body protest with every movement. My head was pounding, and my hands trembled as I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, flipping it on. The room, though still dim, appeared normal. The soft hum of the fluorescent bulb overhead seemed oddly comforting now, like the hotel was finally alive again, no longer holding its breath in anticipation. But it wasn't normal. None of it was. I ran my hand through my hair and glanced around, desperate for something familiar, something that could ground me. The walls, the furniture, the view from the window, they were all the same as they had been when I first arrived. But my mind was no longer the same. I could still feel his presence, like a shadow trailing me, always just beyond the edge of my vision. The man from the attic, the eyes, the voice. It was all so real, so undeniable. I thought about the photo. I thought about everything I had seen, the strange occurrences, the eerie feelings. It all started to click together now. Everything had led me here, to this hotel, to this room. I had been lured in, without even knowing it. I had become part of a story that wasn't mine to begin with, a part of something ancient, something dark. The man in the attic wasn't just a ghost or a figure from the past. He was a part of the hotel. He was the hotel. But even as the realization hit me, I didn't know what to do with it. What could I possibly do now? I could leave. I could check out and never look back, but would that truly set me free? Would it erase the terror, the shadow that had attached itself to me? Would it ever let me go? I stumbled out of bed and rushed to the door, my hands shaking as I gripped the handle. The corridor outside was quiet, too quiet. The air felt thick, as though something was holding it in place, keeping it still. I needed to leave. I had to. But something inside me, the very same force that had dragged me into this situation, was stopping me from walking out. It was as if the hotel itself was holding me captive. I wanted to scream, to run, to get as far away from this place as I could. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no escape. No matter how far I went, no matter how many miles I put between myself and this hotel, it would follow me. The man, the shadows, the eyes, they would always be there. I sank to my knees, the full weight of everything finally crashing down on me. How had I gotten so far into this? What had possessed me to go looking for answers in a place like this? I had wanted to understand, to unravel the mystery, but in doing so, I had sealed my fate. There was no coming back. Hours passed, though I couldn't tell exactly how long. The hotel was empty. It was as if I were the only one left, the only one still trapped in its endless corridors. The staff had disappeared. I had no idea if anyone else was even staying here anymore. The elevator never worked. The doors remained locked. It felt as if the hotel had closed in on itself, trapping me in a time loop of sorts where I couldn't escape and couldn't move forward. Everything was still, silent, dead. I went to the front desk, my heart racing with every step. The receptionist was gone. The lobby was empty, save for the chairs and the old desk, now dusty with disuse. I wandered through the empty hallways, my footsteps echoing in the vast, hollow space. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all, but no answers came. There were no signs of anyone, no signs of life. And then I found a door, hidden at the end of a forgotten hallway. It was small, almost invisible in the dim light. The handle was tarnished, old, and as I touched it, I felt a jolt of cold run through my fingers. This wasn't like the other doors in the hotel. This one felt different, like it was sealed away for a reason. I opened it, and as the door creaked, the smell of dust and decay filled my nose. Beyond it, there was nothing but darkness. But I stepped inside anyway, drawn to it, unable to resist. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the dark. I stood there, alone in the blackness, unable to see my hand in front of my face. But then, from the shadows, I heard it. The same voice. The same cold, raspy whisper. "You've come back," it said. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the void. Just the darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The voice wasn't from any one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding me, filling the empty space. And then I understood. The hotel wasn't just a building. It was a prison, a place where time and space had no meaning. Once you entered, there was no leaving. You became part of it, a permanent fixture in the world of the haunted. The man I had seen, the one who had haunted me from the photo, from the attic, was not just some lost soul. He was part of the hotel's curse. He was trapped here, just as I was now. I wasn't going to escape. None of us would. I don't know how much time passed before I found my way back to the room, but when I did, the hotel was quieter than ever. The lights flickered, and the oppressive silence settled in like a heavy fog. The walls seemed to move in and out, as if they were breathing. I could feel the hotel watching me, waiting for the moment when it would finally claim me, just like it had claimed all the others before me. I didn't even bother to pack my things. I couldn't leave. I couldn't run. I was trapped, and so was everyone else who had ever stayed here. I could feel the man's presence again, his eyes watching me from every corner, his voice still echoing in my mind. The next morning, the hotel was gone. I searched, but it was as if it had never existed. No traces, no signs, only emptiness. I was left with nothing but the knowledge that whatever had happened, whatever curse had befallen this place, was far from over. It had only just begun. The days that followed felt like an eternity. Time moved differently in that place, like it was warped, stretched, and bent to the will of whatever dark force had claimed the hotel. I've heard stories of people vanishing, of entire buildings being swallowed by the earth, but nothing could compare to the way this place had disappeared, like it had never existed in the first place. A few days after I left, I found myself standing on the street, staring at the space where the hotel had once stood. But now there was nothing, only an empty plot of land, as if the hotel had never been there at all. I often wonder if it was real. Was it all just a hallucination, the product of too much stress, too much sleep deprivation? I want to believe that it wasn't, that everything I experienced was a reality, because the truth is even more terrifying. The more I try to forget, the more it haunts me. The man, the voice, the photograph, the hotel itself. I still don't know what I encountered, but I'm sure of one thing: I'll never be the same. I've tried to talk to others about it, to ask around, to see if anyone else knows anything about the hotel, but everyone seems to look at me like I'm crazy. Even when I show them the photograph, the same one I found in that attic, the responses are always the same. Blank stares, awkward silences, and then a hasty change of topic. I can't escape the feeling that no one else sees it the way I do. No one else can understand what happened. They don't feel the weight of the place that lingers in my chest, the constant reminder that whatever was there, it's still out there, waiting. The truth is, I don't know if anyone will ever really know what happened at that hotel. Maybe the hotel wasn't just a building. Maybe it was a portal to something far worse, something that exists in the spaces between worlds. Maybe I was never meant to leave, but for reasons I can't comprehend, I did. But it didn't let me go. I still hear the voice, sometimes low, gravelly, like a distant echo. And when I close my eyes, I can see the man's face again, staring at me with those cold, dark eyes, watching, waiting. The image never leaves me. Even now, as I sit here, typing this out, I can't shake the feeling that something is following me, that I'm being watched. And maybe I am. Maybe this is what happens to those who encounter the truth of places like that hotel. Maybe we're marked forever. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back to the life I had before. Every time I think I'm free, it comes back. The memories, the haunting images, the voice, it's all still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And so, I tell you this. Be careful when you seek out the unknown. Some doors should never be opened. Some questions should never be asked. Because once you let something in, it's not so easy to make it leave.